Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable, history lowers its voice, and the planet becomes a little easier to wonder about before sleep. Tonight, we are setting out across the Atlantic, not toward a country you can visit or a coastline you can photograph, but toward an island that spent centuries sitting confidently on maps, despite the small inconvenience of not actually existing. Its name was Antillia. Sometimes it was called the Isle of Seven Cities. Sometimes it appeared as a large, neat, almost rectangular island far out west of Portugal and Spain, placed there by careful mapmakers who were not trying to make fantasy art, but to describe the world as they understood it. And that is what makes it so interesting. Antillia was not simply a doodle in the margin. It was drawn into serious nautical charts, copied by professional cartographers, discussed by sailors, and treated for a time as a place that might be reached if only a ship went far enough into the uncertain blue. The island makes its first clear appearance as a large rectangular island on the 1424 Portolan chart of Juan Pizzigano, and later appears on many 15th century Atlantic charts, often linked with the older Iberian legend of 7 Christian bishops who fled westward during the Muslim conquest of Hispania and founded 7 settlements across the sea. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Are you near the sea, where old maps can feel a little more believable? Are you far inland, where the Atlantic is just a word on a screen or a blue shape in an atlas? And if there is a map somewhere near you, perhaps on a wall, in a book, or tucked away in an app on your phone, what part of it catches your eye first? Some people look immediately for home, some look for places they have been, others look for the blank spaces, the margins, the far corners where the names become unfamiliar. There is something very human about that. We use maps to feel certain, but we also use them to dream. We ask them where we are, and then, almost without noticing, we ask where else we might go. If you find this quiet journey soothing, or if the thought of a ghost island drifting through old maps is the sort of mystery that helps your mind settle, after a long day, I would be grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this small corner of calm reach others who enjoy slow science, old geography, strange history, and the kind of questions that do not need to be shouted to be interesting. And I do hope tonight's subject is not so intriguing that it keeps you wide awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering whether a missing island might still be hiding somewhere between the Azores and the Caribbean. But if that happens, at least it is a gentle sort of wakefulness, the kind that smells faintly of parchment, sea salt and old wooden ships, which is better than lying awake thinking about emails. So settle in, soften your attention, and let us begin with a simple puzzle. Why did ancient and medieval maps show places that were not there? Not just Antillia, but many strange islands that appeared, disappeared, shifted position, changed shape, and sometimes survived on charts long after sailors should have noticed the problem. To modern eyes, this can seem almost silly. We have satellite images, GPS, flight paths, ocean surveys, and digital maps so detailed that you can zoom in on a cafe table if someone has uploaded the right photograph. When a map today shows something that does not exist, we tend to call it an error. We might blame outdated data, a software glitch, or someone's poor labelling skills. But in the world that gave birth to Antillia, map-making was not simply a matter of measuring everything from above. It was a careful mixture of mathematics, memory, trade routes, rumour, inherited authority, religious storytelling, and the practical experience of sailors who knew some waters well and other waters barely at all. A Portolan chart, the kind of sea chart that helped carry Antillia into history, was a very particular object. It was not the same as a modern school atlas. It was usually drawn for navigation, with coastlines, ports, compass lines, and sailing directions arranged in a way that helped mariners cross known waters. Portolan charts grew out of sailing practice, and the term itself is connected with Portolani. Written sailing directions that listed places, distances and routes, and They preserved the hard-won knowledge of sailors moving through the Mediterranean and increasingly into the Atlantic. These were practical documents, but they were not free from uncertainty. A coastline that had been visited many times could be drawn with impressive confidence. A coastline known only from stories might be drawn with the same ink but far less certainty behind it. Once a feature was placed on a chart, especially by a respected mapmaker, it could gain a kind of borrowed reality. Other mapmakers copied it, adjusted it, decorated it, and passed it onward. In this way, an island could become more durable on parchment than it ever was in the ocean. Antillia belongs to that curious category known as phantom islands. A phantom island is a landmass that appeared on maps for a period of time, sometimes for centuries, before later exploration showed that it was not real, or at least not where people thought it was. Some phantom islands probably began as misidentified real places. A sailor might see clouds on the horizon, a bank of fog, a floating mass of vegetation, or the peak of a distant island distorted by weather, and the report might travel farther than the sighting itself. Others were born from legends, from religious stories, from classical geography, or from the understandable desire to place something solid in a part of the world that still felt dangerously open. The ocean, after all, is not an empty space when you're crossing it in a small ship. It is weather, hunger, current, fear, patience, and hope. A rumoured island could be a danger, a refuge, a destination, or a promise. Even an imaginary island might serve a practical emotional purpose, which sounds like something a map should not need to do. But humans have always asked more from maps than accuracy alone. Antillia's story is especially rich because it sat at the crossing point between legend and exploration. The legend tied to it is usually described as the story of the 7 cities. According to the old Iberian tradition, when Muslim forces entered Hispania in the early 8th century, 7 Christian bishops fled westward with their followers, sailing into the Atlantic and eventually reaching a distant island where they founded 7 settlements. The details vary, as legends tend to do when they have been packed and unpacked over many generations, like a family suitcase that somehow always contains one more pair of socks than anyone remembers putting in it. But the central idea remained powerful. Somewhere beyond the known Western Sea, there was a Christian refuge, a hidden society, a place where loss had been transformed into survival. The island was not only a geographical claim, it was a story about escape, continuity, and a safe shore beyond catastrophe. That matters because maps are not just technical objects. They carry the hopes and fears of the people who make them. A map of the 15th century Atlantic was not simply showing water. It was showing the edge of what Europeans knew, what they had heard, what they wanted, and what they were still afraid to test. In that setting, Antillia did not seem absurd. It fitted into a world where the Atlantic was beginning to open, but had not yet become familiar. The Canary Islands were known. The Azores were being explored and settled by the Portuguese in the 15th century. Mariners were pushing farther down the African coast. Stories of lands to the west had circulated for a long time. To a mapmaker working with reports, inherited texts and sailors' accounts, Antillia may have seemed uncertain, but not impossible. A large island west of Iberia sounded no stranger than many things that later turned out to be true. This is one of the gentle traps of history. We know the ending, so we forget how unclear the beginning felt. We know where the continents are. We know that if you sail west from Europe across the Atlantic, you eventually reach the Americas, not a neat rectangular island with 7 named cities waiting in the open sea. But 15th century mapmakers did not know that in the way we do. They had fragments. They had bearings, rumours, religious traditions, and older geographical habits. They had sailors who returned with stories, and sailors who did not return at all. They had maps that were copied from maps that were copied from other maps. And when knowledge arrives in fragments, people often arrange those fragments into shapes. Sometimes the shape is correct. Sometimes it is Antillia. The island itself, as drawn on maps, was oddly convincing. It was often shown as a large shape with straight sides, placed far west of Portugal and Spain, sometimes around the region west of the Azores. Some maps gave it bays, names, and companion islands. It was not always drawn exactly the same way, but it often had a clear, formal presence, as if the mapmaker were saying, "Yes, here it is. This is a proper place, not a vague suspicion." Later charts commonly showed Antillia with smaller legendary islands nearby, including names such as Roilo, St. Atanasio, and Tanmar, forming a little geography of uncertainty in the Atlantic. This was one of the strangest things about phantom islands. They could have neighbourhoods, they could have neighbours. One imaginary place could keep company with another, and together they could look more believable than either one alone. It is rather like seeing one person waiting at a bus stop and thinking nothing of it, but seeing 7 people waiting there and assuming there must indeed be a bus, even if no bus has ever come. There is also a practical reason such islands were hard to eliminate. In the age before systematic ocean surveys, proving that a place did not exist was difficult. Seeing an island once might be enough to put it on a map. Failing to see it once was not enough to remove it. Perhaps the ship passed too far north. Perhaps fog hid the coast. Perhaps the latitude was wrong. Perhaps the island lay a little farther west. Perhaps the earlier report referred to a different island. Absence, especially at sea, is a slippery kind of evidence. The Atlantic is large, and old navigation was imprecise by modern standards. Longitude in particular was extremely hard to measure accurately at sea before reliable marine chronometers, so an island could survive many failed searches simply because uncertainty gave it room to move. Antillia, in that sense, did not need to hide perfectly. It only needed the ocean to remain big enough and human doubt to remain generous enough. It helps to imagine the mapmaker's desk. Not a glowing monitor with clean satellite data, but parchment, ink, compasses, rulers, older charts, written accounts, and perhaps conversations with sailors who had been frightened, tired, proud, mistaken, or all 4 in the same afternoon. The mapmaker had to decide what belonged. Leave out a real island, and a sailor might lose a useful landmark. Include a false one, and another sailor might chase a coast that never arrives. Neither mistake is ideal, though one does produce better mysteries for people many centuries later. In that world, copying an established feature may have seemed safer than deleting it. If respected charts showed Antillia, removing it required confidence, and confidence is easy when you have satellite imagery. It is harder when your best information is a damp sailor pointing at a smudged direction and saying, "I heard it was somewhere over there." This is why Antillia is not only a story about error. It is a story about how knowledge is built before it becomes certain. We tend to imagine discovery as a clean moment. Someone sails, sees land, writes it down, and the map changes. But the history of geography is often messier. A place can be rumoured before it is found. A real discovery can be misunderstood. A myth can be drawn with technical skill. A map can be partly accurate and partly imaginary, without anyone involved being foolish. The same chart might guide ships safely along familiar coasts, while also carrying an island that no ship would ever reach. That mixture feels strange today, but it is not so different from the way we live with information now. We still copy things because others have copied them. We still trust claims that appear in serious-looking formats. We still confuse repetition with proof, especially when the claim is tidy, useful, or pleasant to believe. The parchment has become a screen, but the habit is very much alive. And Antillia was pleasant to believe, at least in some ways. It offered the idea that the Western Ocean was not only emptiness, it suggested refuge, it suggested hidden civilization, it suggested that beyond the dangerous horizon there might be cities, bells, churches, markets, fields, and people who had escaped history's violence and built something enduring. That is a powerful idea. People do not only explore for gold, trade or empire, although those motives certainly arrived with heavy boots. They also explore because unknown space invites stories. A blank area on a map is uncomfortable. It asks to be filled. Sometimes it is filled with careful observation, sometimes with monsters, sometimes with warnings, sometimes with islands where 7 bishops and their communities are said to have made a new beginning. The name itself would later echo in another way. After Columbus's voyages, Europeans began applying names related to Antillia to real islands in the Caribbean, giving us the Antilles. The relationship between the old Phantom Island and the later naming of the West Indian island groups has been discussed by historians, and it shows how a legendary geography could leave traces even after the original island faded from belief. In other words, Antillia vanished as a place, but not entirely as a name. That is quite a graceful exit for an island that was never there. It did not sink. It did not explode. It did not need a dramatic ending. It simply migrated from one kind of map to another, from imagined Atlantic landmass to linguistic shadow, from lost island to historical clue. For tonight, though, we do not need to rush ahead to the moment Antillia disappears. The more interesting question at the beginning is why it looked so real in the first place. Why did it have a shape? Why did it have cities? Why did professional mapmakers continue to draw it? Why did a rectangular island in the Atlantic feel credible enough to survive in ink? The answer is not one thing. It is a slow gathering of things: legend, copying, uncertain navigation, partial exploration, religious memory, sailors' reports, and the basic human preference for a known something over an unknown nothing. Antillia existed in the space between evidence and expectation. That is a very crowded space, even today. So, as we drift into this story, picture the Atlantic not as we see it now, measured and crossed and photographed, but as it appeared to a 15th century mind looking west. The known coasts of Europe and Africa lie behind. The islands already reached sit like stepping stones in the sea. Beyond them is a large blue uncertainty, wide enough to hold fear, ambition, and rumour. On one chart, then another, a large island appears. It is too carefully drawn to ignore. It has a name, it has a legend. It has 7 cities, and for generations it waits there quietly on the parchment, inviting sailors and scholars to wonder whether the map is preserving a discovery, repeating a mistake, or giving shape to a story that people were not yet ready to let go. From there, the first real thing to examine is not the legend, but the island's body on the map itself. That strangely neat rectangle in the Atlantic, drawn with the confidence of land, sitting where no land was waiting. That strange rectangle in the Atlantic is where Antillia becomes more than a legend. A legend can stay soft around the edges. It can be told beside a fire, repeated in a port, whispered by a sailor who's just had slightly too much wine, and nobody has to decide exactly how many miles wide it is. But the moment a mapmaker draws it, the story changes. Now the island has edges, it has position, it has scale. It sits among other places, near some and far from others. It stops being only a tale and begins to act like geography. That is what makes Antillia so fascinating. It was not drawn as a vague smudge or a decorative flourish in the empty sea. On the 1424 Portolan chart associated with the Venetian cartographer Juan Pizzigano, Antillia appears as a large red rectangular island in the Atlantic, part of a group of legendary islands that later mapmakers would continue to copy through much of the 15th century. To modern eyes, the shape is almost the first odd thing about it. Islands are rarely polite enough to form rectangles. Real coastlines tend to wander. They bulge, crumble, curve, fold inward, and fray into capes and bays. Even a fairly simple island has a coastline that looks as though the sea has been chewing on it for a very long time, because of course it has. Antillia, by contrast, often looks as though someone set down a brick in the Atlantic and decided it was land. Its long axis usually runs north to south. It has a broad formal outline, and in many later versions it is marked with bays along its sides, sometimes associated with the 7 cities of the legend. It does not look natural in the way a coastline usually looks natural. But it does look intentional, and that is important, because the rectangle gave the island a kind of authority. It made it readable, it made it easy to copy. It gave other map makers a clear model to follow, which is very convenient if you are drawing by hand and very inconvenient if the thing you're copying is not actually there. The Pizzigano chart itself belongs to a practical tradition. A Portolan chart was made for navigation, with coastlines, ports and networks of direction lines that helped sailors move across known waters. These charts grew from maritime practice, and the word is connected to portolani, sailing directions that listed places, distances and courses. The University of Minnesota's James Ford Bell Library, which holds the 1424 chart, describes Portolan charts as manuscript maps centred on the sea and the ports around it, preserving sailors' first-hand knowledge while also showing their expanding knowledge of the Atlantic. That is a very useful thing to remember. Antillia did not appear in a book of fairy tales. It appeared in a kind of document associated with serious seafaring. It sat among coasts, islands, lines, labels, and distances. It was placed in a visual language that sailors and map makers took seriously. So even if the island was imaginary, the format around it was not. This is one reason phantom islands can be so persuasive. They do not always arrive looking ridiculous. They arrive wearing the clothes of fact. A monster in the margin is easy to treat as decoration. A large island with a name, drawn in the same general manner as real islands, placed among known archipelagos is harder to dismiss. Antillia was given that kind of treatment. It appeared west of Portugal and Spain, in the broad ocean beyond the familiar coasts, and on the Pizzigano chart it was not alone. It formed part of a small Atlantic group that included Antillia itself, Saturnases to the north, Imena to the west, and Saya farther north, with later versions often changing or adapting some of those names. This is a curious little neighbourhood of uncertainty. One phantom island might be a rumour. Several phantom islands arranged in relation to one another begin to look like a reported archipelago. And if you have ever watched one unverified detail make another unverified detail feel more believable, you will recognise the pattern. It is the cartographic equivalent of hearing two people repeat the same story and thinking, well, surely they cannot both be wrong, while forgetting that the second person may simply have heard it from the first. Still, the mapmaker was not necessarily being careless. The Atlantic in the early 15th century was not the tidy blue space we see on modern maps. It was a working frontier of knowledge. The Canary Islands were known to Europeans. Madeira had entered Portuguese knowledge in the early 15th century. The Azores were appearing in maps and reports around this period, though the exact stages of their recognition and settlement are not always as tidy as a textbook timeline might suggest. Sailors, merchants, rulers, and cartographers were trying to make sense of a widening ocean. New islands really were being found. Reports really did travel. Some reports were accurate, some were confused, some were misunderstood. And in that atmosphere, a large island far to the west could seem questionable without seeming impossible. It was not like drawing a second moon over Lisbon. It was more like drawing an island in a place where the ocean had not yet been fully searched, and where other islands had already turned out to exist. There is also the matter of scale. On some later maps, Antillia is shown at a size comparable to Portugal, which is not a small claim for an island that nobody could quite visit. A tiny speck might have been easier to excuse as a misread shoal or a remote rock. Antillia was bolder than that. It occupied the Atlantic with confidence. Its size suggested importance. This was not a little navigational note saying, perhaps there is something here, do watch your keel. It was a major landmass, large enough to hold settlements, large enough to matter politically and imaginatively. And because it was large, its absence becomes more striking to us now. A small phantom island might hide behind fog, poor coordinates, or one unlucky voyage. A large rectangular island west of Iberia feels as though it should have been discovered rather quickly if it existed. But again, that is modern hindsight speaking in a calm voice, while standing on a mountain of later surveys. In the 15th century, the ocean still had room for mistakes with quite a lot of elbow space. The rectangle may also tell us something about how mapmakers handled information that was heard rather than seen. When a coastline is known from repeated sailing, it can become intricate. Headlands, harbours, river mouths, and dangerous shallows can be marked because sailors have reason to know them. But when a place is reported at a distance without reliable details, a mapmaker may give it a schematic form. The shape becomes less a portrait of the land than a placeholder for the idea of land. Antillia's straight edges may not have been meant to say, "This island is literally a perfect block of earth." They may have said, "Here is the island as we understand it, large, bounded, western and important." The bays and city marks then give the schematic form a little more texture, enough to make it feel inhabited, but not enough to turn it into a truly observed coastline. It is rather like drawing a house as a square with a triangle on top. Nobody thinks all houses look exactly like that, but the symbol does its job. Antillia may have been doing the job of a reported island before anyone could properly describe its shore. This symbolic quality does not make it meaningless. Quite the opposite. A simple shape can travel easily through copies. Once Antillia had acquired that recognizable rectangular outline, later cartographers could reproduce it with relatively little trouble. It became a cartographic character, almost like a face in a family album. The details could shift, the colouring could change, the orientation might tilt, the labels might vary. But the core identity remained visible. There it was again, the long island in the Western Ocean, with its bays, its cities, and its quiet promise of a shore beyond the known world. The 1424 Pizzigano chart is widely described as the first clear depiction of Antillia, and later 15th century cartographers including Battista Beccario, Andrea Bianco, and Gracioso Benincasa are often cited among those who repeated or adapted the Antillia group. Repetition did not prove the island existed, but it did prove the idea was useful enough, familiar enough, or respected enough to remain on parchment. This is where maps become quietly social objects. We sometimes imagine a map maker alone with truth, simply drawing what is there. But a medieval or early modern map maker was also in conversation with other maps. He inherited outlines, names, conventions, authorities, and expectations. A blank area was not always left blank if earlier sources had filled it. Removing a feature required a decision, and decisions need reasons. If Antillia had been copied by respected hands, a later mapmaker might hesitate before leaving it out. What if the island did exist and he omitted it? What if sailors expected to see it? What if patrons associated it with valuable knowledge? What if the safest professional choice was not to correct the map, but to preserve what other maps had already said? Copying can feel passive, but it is often a form of caution. It says, "I will not be the one to erase what others have recorded." And so the ghost stays. Of course, there is a gentle irony in that. A map is meant to reduce uncertainty, but sometimes it preserves uncertainty by making it look certain. Once Antillia was placed on charts, it could become evidence for itself. Someone might ask, how do we know this island exists? And the answer could be, because it is on the map. That sounds silly when said plainly, but it is not far from how authority often works. A claim printed in a serious book feels stronger than the same claim muttered by a stranger. A line on official paper feels firmer than a rumour. A neat label in fine ink has weight. Antillia benefited from that weight. It had the calm appearance of a known place, and calm appearances can be very persuasive, especially when everyone involved would rather not admit how little is known about the far side of the sea. The island's placement also mattered. It was not floating anywhere at random. It occupied the Atlantic west of Iberia, in a direction already charged with speculation. For European sailors and scholars, the Western Ocean was both a barrier and an invitation. Classical traditions, medieval legends, practical exploration, and Christian imagination all mingled there. Islands were especially easy to imagine in that space because islands had already served as stepping stones in real navigation. The Canaries, Madeira, and the Azores made the Atlantic feel less like a single impossible emptiness and more like a scattered field of possibilities. If some islands had been found, perhaps others remained. If one group lay out there, perhaps another did too. A rectangle in the Atlantic may seem strange, but a chain of island rumours in an age of island discoveries was not strange at all. It was the sort of thing one might expect the ocean to produce. There is another, more practical detail that helped Phantom Island survive: the difficulty of proving a negative. Sailing past the supposed location of an island and not seeing it did not necessarily settle the matter. Old navigation had margins of error. Bad weather could hide land. Currents could push a ship off course. A reported latitude might be wrong. Longitude was especially troublesome at sea before reliable clock-based methods, which meant east-west position could be uncertain by large distances. Even if a captain searched and found nothing, someone could always say the island was farther west, farther south, partly obscured or confused with another report. In a large ocean, a missing island has many excuses. It is almost admirable in the way a child's lost homework has many excuses. The dog ate it, the wind took it, the bag swallowed it, the island moved a little beyond the Azores. Not all excuses are equally convincing, but they can keep a belief alive when the cost of abandoning it feels higher than the cost of waiting. Antillia's rectangular body also sits at an interesting midpoint between the practical and the legendary. The seven-city tradition gave the island a human story, but the map gave that story a physical stage. Without the map, the legend could remain in memory, adaptable and distant. Without the legend, the shape might be only another uncertain Atlantic feature. Together they strengthened one another. The rectangle told viewers where the story happened. The story told viewers why the rectangle mattered. This is why the bays and city marks are so important. They transformed Antillia from a geographical maybe into a settled island. The old legend connected Antillia with 7 Christian bishops and their followers who fled westward during the Muslim conquest of Hispania, founding 7 settlements on the island. Those 7 settlements gave the island internal structure. It was not merely land, it was a society, at least in imagination. And once a map shows settlements, the viewer naturally begins to think of people. Houses, churches, roads, fields, harbours, meals being cooked, bells being rung, someone somewhere complaining that the bread is too hard. Civilization makes geography feel real. The shape may have also carried a sense of order. Antillia was not drawn like a wild, jagged, unknowable place. Its broad sides and repeated bays made it seem organised, almost administrative. That fits the legend rather well. 7 bishops, 7 communities, 7 cities. There is a tidy rhythm to the idea, though we are not trying to be too lyrical about it, because even ghost islands should not be allowed to become smug. The point is that Antillia's map form matched its story form. A strange, chaotic coastline might have suggested wilderness. A rectangular island with evenly distributed settlements suggested planning, hierarchy and endurance. It looked like a place that had been founded, not merely found. And for a story about refugees building a new Christian community across the sea, that kind of order mattered. There is something almost bureaucratic about the way Antillia appears, which makes it even more haunting. Many imagined places announce themselves with extravagance. They have impossible mountains, golden cities, monstrous inhabitants, or rivers that behave in ways rivers should not, which is very rude of them. Antillia's first impression is quieter. It says, here is an island, here are its bays, here are its settlements, here is its position. It is not waving its arms, it is simply present. That quietness may be part of why it endured. The island did not ask viewers to believe in dragons. It asked them to accept a plausible-looking landmass in a poorly known ocean. That is a much smaller request, and small requests can be more dangerous to accuracy than large ones. It is easier to doubt a flying castle than a neatly drawn island. Looking closely at the rectangle also reminds us that maps are never purely neutral. Even the choice to leave a space empty says something. Empty ocean could mean unknown, unimportant, open for travel, or open for possession, depending on who was looking. Filling that ocean with Antillia changed the mental geography of the Atlantic. It made the West seem interrupted by refuge. It inserted Christian memory into the sea. It suggested that the ocean had hidden history inside it, not just water. For Iberian viewers especially, the story of flight from conquest would have carried emotional weight. It linked distant geography to familiar historical trauma. A faraway island became a container for memory. This did not make it real in the physical sense, but it made it meaningful. And meaningful places can be stubborn. One can imagine a sailor studying such a chart by lamplight. The coast of Portugal lies behind him in memory. The known islands sit like markers in the ocean. Then his eye moves farther west and finds Antillia. Perhaps he does not fully believe in it. Perhaps he does. Perhaps belief is not even the right word. Sailors can be practical and superstitious in the same breath, which is understandable when your workplace is a moving wooden object surrounded by weather. The island might be a possible landfall, a warning, a curiosity, or simply something one has heard about. The map does not explain its uncertainty, it just shows the shape, and that is enough to put the idea into the room. The rectangular outline also reveals how imagination can become standardized. Many people can tell the same legend in different ways, but a map freezes one version into a form that others can repeat. Antillia may have had roots in older stories, but the Pizzigano-style depiction helped fix its visual identity. Once fixed, it could travel from chart to chart. This is a powerful process. Think of how certain images become the standard version of something we have never personally seen. A dinosaur posture, an ancient city skyline, a portrait of a historical figure made centuries after death. Once the image becomes familiar, it becomes hard to replace, even when evidence changes. Antillia's rectangle worked in a similar way. It gave people a picture to remember. The Atlantic did not merely contain a rumour now. It contained that island, with that general shape. There were naturally changes across maps. Andrea Bianco's 1436 chart, for example, shows Antillia differently from Pizzigano in some respects, with adjustments in orientation and form noted by later commentators. Other mapmakers refined, simplified, or embellished the island. This variation tells us that Antillia was not copied mechanically without thought. It was interpreted. Each mapmaker received the idea and made choices about how to fit it into his own chart. A ghost island, oddly enough, can have a cartographic evolution. It can develop features. It can drift slightly. It can become more decorative or more restrained. It can be made to match new assumptions. The ocean remained the same, but the imagined island adjusted to the hands that drew it. By lingering over this shape, we begin to see why Antillia is such a useful case study in the history of knowledge. It shows that false information does not always look false at the time. It can be embedded in good methods, professional tools, and reasonable expectations. The same culture of mapping that helped sailors navigate real seas also helped preserve an island that was not there. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is a reminder that human knowledge often advances through uncertain layers. People draw what they know, what they think they know, what they have heard, what they trust, and what they are not yet ready to discard. Over time, observation pushes back. Ships sail, reports accumulate, empty water becomes harder to ignore. The rectangle loses confidence. But in the early phase, while the West was still open and reports were still uneven, Antillia could stand quite comfortably among the possible things. There is a quiet lesson in the island's neatness. The world itself is irregular, but our attempts to understand it often begin with simple shapes. We draw boxes around problems, we make lists. We divide history into periods, oceans into routes, continents into colours, and days into hours, which is helpful until one of those hours contains a dentist appointment, in which case it expands suspiciously. Antillia's rectangle was a simple shape placed over a complicated unknown. It made the Atlantic feel a little more organised. It suggested that the blankness had content. And for mapmakers and viewers living at the edge of expanding exploration, that may have been deeply appealing. The more we look at Antillia as a rectangle, the less it seems like a random mistake and the more it seems like a meeting point. It is where a legend met a navigational format. It is where uncertain reports met professional copying. It is where religious memory met Atlantic exploration. It is where the human love of order met the ocean's refusal to provide easy answers. The rectangle did not float on the water. It floated in the habits of map-making, the hopes of viewers, and the slow movement of information from mouth to manuscript to chart. That is why it could last. Not because it was seen by many eyes, but because it was held by many systems at once. And within that rectangular outline, the detail that gave Antillia its strongest personality was not its coast, or its colour, or even its position west of Portugal. It was the idea that this island contained 7 cities. The map gave Antillia a body, but the 7 cities gave it a life. They turned an unlikely landmass into a refuge with people, leaders, churches, and a history of escape. To understand why the rectangle remained so compelling, we have to step inside it, not as explorers landing on a real shore, but as listeners following the old Iberian story that placed 7 communities beyond the Western Sea. The 7 cities gave Antillia something that a simple island shape could never provide on its own. They gave it a reason to exist in the minds of the people who copied it, searched for it and wondered about it. A rectangle in the Atlantic is odd, certainly, but a rectangle with 7 lost cities is much harder to ignore. It becomes a place with a story attached to it, and stories are very good at surviving bad weather. They can cross borders, outlive the people who first told them, and settle into maps with the confidence of a guest who was only invited for tea, but somehow stays for 300 years. In the older Iberian tradition, Antillia was connected to the Muslim conquest of Hispania in the early 8th century, when Christian refugees were said to have fled westward across the Atlantic. The usual version tells of 7 Visigothic Christian bishops, often led by the bishop or archbishop of Porto, who sailed away with their followers and eventually founded 7 settlements on a distant island. To understand why that story mattered, we need to spend a little time with the world it remembered. In the early 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula went through a profound political and religious transformation. The Visigothic kingdom, which had ruled much of Hispania, collapsed under the pressure of Muslim armies arriving from North Africa. Later, Christian memory would return to this moment again and again, not simply as a military defeat, but as a great rupture in the order of the world. Lands changed hands, cities changed rulers. Churches, elites, families and communities had to decide whether to remain, negotiate, flee, resist, or adapt. Out of real upheaval came many later stories, and Antillia belongs to that tradition of memory shaped by loss. It is not a reliable chronicle of events. Nobody has found the actual ships, the island, or the 7 cities. But as a legend, it tells us something about what people wished might have happened. That some part of the old Christian world had escaped intact, sailing beyond danger and rebuilding itself where the conquerors could not follow. There is a very human comfort in that idea. When a world changes too quickly, people imagine safe places beyond the edge of the map. Sometimes those places are valleys hidden in mountains. Sometimes they are kingdoms behind deserts. Sometimes they are islands in the sea. Antillia was an island of survival. In the story, the bishops did not merely flee alone, clutching manuscripts and looking dramatic in the wind. They brought communities with them, men, women, belongings, and in some versions even cattle and property. This detail is important because it makes the journey feel like a transfer of society, not just an escape by a few leaders. The refugees were not going west to vanish. They were going west to continue. They carried the ingredients of ordinary life, which is often what legends need in order to feel believable. A lost island with only bishops might seem a little lonely, and also very bad at farming. A lost island with families, animals, tools, food and memory begins to feel like a real colony. The burning of the ships is one of the most striking parts of the legend. In several versions, once the refugees reached the island, they destroyed or burned their vessels so that no one could return to the lands they had left behind. It is a dramatic image, and like many dramatic images, it may tell us more about meaning than fact. Burning the ship says that the old life is over. It says that the sea has become a wall rather than a road. It says that the new settlement is not temporary. There will be no nervous looking back toward the east, no committee meeting about whether perhaps everyone should go home after all, no bishop quietly asking if anyone remembered where they parked the boat. The act turns flight into foundation. The island becomes not a refuge for a season, but a permanent Christian world beyond the horizon. That kind of finality gives a legend weight. It makes Antillia feel like a place built out of decision. The number 7 also helped the story endure. 7 is one of those numbers that appears again and again in religious, literary and symbolic traditions. 7 days of creation, 7 virtues, 7 sins, 7 seals, 7 lamps, 7 heavens in some traditions, and many other examples that gave the number a sense of completeness. In the Antillia legend, 7 bishops found 7 cities, and that neatness is probably not accidental. A messy number like 6 or 11 would not have carried quite the same authority. 7 feels ordered. It feels finished. It gives the island a structure that is easy to remember and easy to repeat. A sailor, a monk, a merchant or a mapmaker could hold the idea in the mind without needing many details. 7 bishops, 7 cities, a hidden island in the west. That is the sort of formula a story can travel with. Some later cartographic traditions even gave names to the cities. One reading associated with maps in the tradition of Gracioso Benincasa lists names such as Aira, Antuab, Ansali, Ancesali, Ansodi, Ansoli, and Con. Though spellings vary and the names can feel more like echoes passed through ink than settled civic records. These names are fascinating because they do the same work that the rectangle did. They make the island appear more specific. A nameless city can be imagined, but a named city begins to look as though someone has been there and asked directions. A map with labels invites trust. Even if the labels are garbled, copied badly, misunderstood, or invented from uncertain sources, they still give the viewer something to hold on to. We're used to trusting names on maps. The habit is old. Put a name beside a dot or a bay, and the mind quietly says, "Ah, so this place has been accounted for." It is worth slowing down here, because this is one of the central mechanisms by which Antillia gained its strange life. A legend can be questioned because legends are expected to be flexible. A map, however, looks like a record. When the 7 cities entered cartography, the story acquired a physical layout. Each bishop was no longer only a figure in a tale. Each city could be imagined as occupying part of the island. The old rectangle could be divided by memory. Perhaps one city sat near a bay on the eastern coast, another on the western side, another toward the north. The details were not stable, but the suggestion was enough. The map didn't need to show streets, walls, churches, or market squares. It only needed to imply settlement. From there, the viewer could supply the rest. Smoke from hearths, bells in the morning, people speaking an old Iberian tongue, children growing up who had never seen the mainland their grandparents left behind. That last idea was especially powerful. In some later versions of the Antillia story, the inhabitants were imagined as descendants of the original refugees, still speaking the language of Spain or Portugal, still preserving a Christian society cut off from the mainland. Martin Behem's 1492 Nuremberg Globe contains one of the famous early descriptions of the Antillia legend, saying that the island, also called Septe Cidade, was settled by an archbishop from Porto with 6 other bishops and Christian companions after the Moors conquered Spain and Portugal. The inscription also mentions that a Spanish vessel supposedly came near the island in 1414. This is not proof of the island, of course, but it is proof that the story had become substantial enough to be written into a major geographical object at the very moment Europe was standing on the edge of a much larger Atlantic age. The Globe did not present Antillia as a bedtime rumour. It folded the legend into world geography. That timing matters. In 1492, the Atlantic was changing very quickly in European awareness. Portuguese voyages had been moving down the African coast for decades. Atlantic islands such as Madeira, the Canaries, Cape Verde and the Azores were known or being settled in different stages. Columbus sailed west in the same year Baham's globe was made, convinced he could reach Asia by crossing the ocean. In such a world, the Isle of Seven Cities did not feel like a harmless medieval leftover. It felt like a possible clue. If a Christian island lay somewhere in the Western Sea, then the Atlantic was not simply an obstacle between Europe and Asia. It was a route with stepping stones. It might contain harbours, supplies, people, information, and maybe even wealth. A legend that had once offered comfort could become useful to explorers, rulers and investors, which is often when legends begin to attract paperwork. And Antillia did attract paperwork. In 1475, King Afonso V of Portugal granted the knight Fernão Teles rights connected with the Seven Cities and any other populated islands he might find in the Western Atlantic. In 1486, King João II authorised Fernão Dulmo to search for the island of Seven Cities. This is one of the most revealing parts of the whole story. The Seven Cities were not only drawn by mapmakers and repeated by storytellers. They entered royal grants and exploratory plans. That does not mean Portuguese kings knew the island was real. Medieval and early modern rulers could grant rights to places not yet found, partly because the grant cost little unless someone actually found something, which is a very convenient way of being generous with the unknown. But the documents show that the island was credible enough to be treated as a possible prize. Antillia had moved from memory to map to policy, which is quite an achievement for land with no address. The Seven Cities also fitted neatly into the ambitions of Iberian expansion. A populated Christian island in the Atlantic would have mattered politically. If its people came from an older Iberian Christian lineage, who could claim them? Portugal, Castile, some other authority. If they had lived apart for centuries, did they need protection, conversion, alliance, taxation, rescue, or perhaps just a polite visit with a very complicated flag ceremony? These questions may sound a little humorous, but they were not trivial in a period when islands, trade routes, and claims of discovery carried real power. A legendary Christian community across the sea could be imagined not only as a marvel, but as a possession waiting to be connected back to Europe. The island's religious story made it emotionally compelling. Its supposed population made it politically interesting. Its location made it strategically tempting. That is a strong combination, even before anyone starts whispering about silver in the sand. By the late 15th century, some reports connected Antillia or the Seven Cities with wealth. One later map inscription around 1500 described the island as a Portuguese colony and claimed that silver could be found in its sands. This is a familiar pattern in the history of exploration. A remote place begins as a refuge, then becomes a marvel, then becomes a source of riches in rumour. The same story starts wearing different clothes depending on who is listening. For the devout, the island could be a preserved Christian society. For the sailor, it could be a landfall. For the ruler, a claim. For the merchant, a possible opportunity. For the mapmaker, a feature to be placed carefully west of Europe. For the ordinary listener, perhaps just a splendid thing to think about, while the rain taps at the window and the fire gets low. Antillia could serve many needs because it was still vague enough to be useful to all of them. This flexibility helped the Seven Cities legend survive even as geographical knowledge changed. After Columbus reached the Caribbean, the old idea did not vanish immediately. Instead, like many durable legends, it adjusted. The name Antillia became connected in later European geography with the Antilles, the island groups of the Caribbean. The Seven Cities motif also drifted into the Americas, where it became entangled with Spanish stories of wealthy inland cities, including the later legend of the Seven Cities of Gold. The original island west of Portugal faded, but the pattern remained. Somewhere beyond the known frontier there are cities, hidden, rich, ancient, waiting. This is one of the reasons Antillia feels larger than itself. It was not only a phantom island, it was part of a wider habit of imagining organised human worlds just beyond verified knowledge. There is a danger, though, in treating the legend only as a stepping stone toward later exploration myths. Antillia deserves to be understood on its own terms, as a medieval Atlantic story shaped by Iberian memory. Its emotional centre is not treasure, it is exile. The bishops are not searching for gold, they are fleeing collapse. Their followers are not conquerors, they are refugees. The ships do not arrive with soldiers looking for new dominions, at least not in the original shape of the tale. They arrive with people trying to preserve a way of life. That gives the legend a quieter tone than many later stories of golden cities. Antillia's first promise was not that Europe could take something from the West, but that something European and Christian had already survived there. It was a lost piece of home, not yet a prize. That idea would have had a special pull in the Iberian world, where centuries of Christian-Muslim conflict, coexistence, reconquest and memory created a dense historical background. The tale of 7 bishops escaping the conquest turned a traumatic origin into a hopeful geography. It said that defeat was not complete. Somewhere beyond the reach of armies and political change, the old order continued. The cities were like sealed containers of continuity. Whether anyone truly believed this literally is hard to know. Belief is not always a simple yes or no. People can half believe a story, hope it is true, repeat it because others do, or treat it as possible without committing themselves entirely. The 7 cities lived in that broad middle ground between faith, rumour, and usefulness. Many persistent ideas live there. It is a very comfortable place, unfortunately for anyone trying to keep records tidy. One of the most interesting details is how ordinary the 7 cities must have seemed once imagined. We are tempted to picture them as wondrous, shining, almost magical. But the legend's strength may have come from the opposite. These were cities founded by bishops and their followers, which suggests churches, fields, houses, workshops and routines. The people of Antillia, if imagined seriously, would need bread, water, timber, livestock, marriages, disputes, repairs, weather reports, and someone to complain about the price of fish. This ordinariness made the island more believable. A fantasy kingdom made entirely of gold is impressive, but a distant island with 7 Christian towns sounds almost administratively plausible. You can imagine a tax list. You can imagine a bishop writing a letter. You can imagine a harbour where a ship might anchor, though perhaps only after several sailors argue about the wind for an unreasonable length of time. The religious leadership in the story also gave the island moral structure. 7 bishops meant 7 centres of authority. Each city had a shepherd, a congregation, and a reason to exist. In medieval Christian thinking, a city was not merely a cluster of buildings, it could be a spiritual community organised around church life. So the 7 cities were not just settlements. They were an ordered Christian society, replicated across a new island. The legend takes the broken structure of a conquered homeland and reassembles it offshore. That is perhaps why the cities are 7 rather than 1. One city would be a refuge. 7 cities become a world. They suggest completeness, distribution, stability, and a future that can last beyond the first generation. At the same time, the legend raises practical questions that no version answers very well, which is one way you can tell you are dealing with a good medieval story. How did the refugees navigate so far west? What did they eat on the voyage? How did they find the island? Why did no regular contact continue with Europe? If they burned their ships, how did later reports of them return? If a Spanish ship came near in 1414, Why did it not bring back clear coordinates? If Portuguese sailors supposedly reached or sighted the island, why did the place remain so elusive? These questions are obvious to us, and they may have occurred to some people then as well. But legends do not survive by passing an audit. They survive because their central image is stronger than the objections around it. 7 bishops sailing into the Western Sea and founding 7 cities is a strong image. The logistical paperwork can wait until morning. There are also variants, as there always are with old stories. Some versions shift the origin point. Some emphasise Porto. Others connect the refugees more broadly with Spain or Portugal. Later writers sometimes placed the story in different years or attached it to different figures. Manuel de Faria e Sousa, writing much later, gave a variant involving a Visigothic governor of Merida named Sakaru, who leaves with followers in the face of Muslim pressure and may end up on an Atlantic island associated with 7 cities. These changes show that Antillia was not a fixed historical claim handed down unchanged. It was a legend with movable parts. Different communities and writers could reshape it to fit their own historical memory, geography, or national pride. The island stayed in the west, but the road to it could be retold. This variability did not weaken the legend as much as we might expect. In fact, it may have helped. A story with some flexible details can adapt to new audiences. If one version no longer convinces, another can take its place. The central claim remains simple. During a time of crisis, Christian refugees crossed the Atlantic and founded 7 cities on a hidden island. The names, dates, leaders, and sightings could shift around that core. Think of it like a coat that has been patched many times. It is not the original fabric throughout, but it still keeps the story warm. And as long as maps continued to show Antillia, the legend had a place to live. The relationship between the cities and the island was therefore circular in the most interesting way. The cities made the island believable because they gave it history. The island made the cities believable because it gave them location. A listener could ask where the refugees went, and the map could answer, there, west of Iberia. A map viewer could ask what that island was, and the legend could answer, the place of the 7 cities. Each part supported the other. This is how imagined geography hardens, not all at once, but through repetition between story and image, between word and line, between memory and measurement. The evidence may be weak, but the structure around it becomes strong. And so, the 7 cities sat beyond the edge of the known world, not simply as dots on a chart, but as a small, complete society imagined into the Atlantic. They represented survival after conquest, order after flight, and continuity after loss. They gave sailors something to wonder about and rulers something to grant. They gave mapmakers labels to write, and viewers a reason to pause. Their power came from the way they combined the familiar with the unreachable. Bishops, cities, churches, cattle, language, and community were all familiar. The far western island was not. Put them together, and the unknown becomes less empty. It becomes a place where ordinary life might be happening just out of reach. That is why the legend mattered so much to the maps. Antillia was not drawn only because someone thought there might be land in the Atlantic. It was drawn because a story had already prepared people to expect meaningful land there. The 7 cities gave the rectangle a population, a past, and a purpose. They made the map's claim easier to imagine, and imagination, once organised, can be surprisingly durable. From here, the next step is to watch how that durability worked in practice, how a tale told through memory and faith could move into the technical world of coastlines, compass lines, pigments, and parchment, until a legend began to look less like a legend and more like a place a ship might actually find. A legend becomes harder to dismiss once someone gives it a coastline. While it remains only a story, it can drift. It can change size from one telling to the next. It can sit comfortably in the mind without needing a latitude, a harbour, or a reliable supply of fresh water. But once the story is drawn onto a map, something peculiar happens. The coastline begins to behave like evidence. It makes the tale look as though it has been measured, or at least heard from someone who measured it, or at the very least copied from someone who owned a ruler and looked serious while using it. Antillia is one of those places where this transformation can be watched almost in slow motion. A memory of 7 bishops fleeing across the sea becomes an island. The island gets a shape. The shape gets bays. The bays get names. The names get copied. And before long, a story that once belonged to the uncertain world of legend is sitting beside real islands on a chart that sailors might unfold with practical intentions. This is where we have to be careful with the word legend. It is tempting to use it as a polite way of saying falsehood, but that is not quite fair. A legend is not always a lie. It is often a memory that has been reshaped by fear, hope, politics, religion, and repetition. It may contain a historical seed, or it may contain no seed at all, only the soil of human need. Either way, it can still influence what people do. The legend of Antillia did not need to be factually correct to become important. It only needed to be believable enough, useful enough, and repeated in the right settings. Once it entered the world of maps, it gained a new kind of life. It became part of how people pictured the Atlantic, and the way people picture a place can guide ships, money, decisions, and daydreams, which is a surprisingly busy workload for an island nobody can find. Medieval and early Renaissance maps didn't all have the same purpose. Some were made for navigation, some were made to summarize religious or classical knowledge, some were made to impress patrons, some were made to organize the world according to theology, trade, empire, or inherited scholarship. A map might be a tool, a teaching object, a status symbol, or a kind of visual argument. This matters because the standards of proof were not the same in every case. A sailor's chart of the Mediterranean coastline needed practical reliability because rocks, ports, and currents have a very direct way of correcting bad geography. A world map hanging in a learned setting could include biblical places, classical references, distant marvels, and inherited names without anyone expecting to steer a ship by every inch of it. The trouble, or the charm, begins when these traditions overlap. A legendary island enters a practical-looking map, and the viewer is left unsure whether the ink is preserving navigation, memory, rumour, or all three politely sharing a small table. Antillia moved through that overlap. Its story belonged to Christian Iberian memory, but its mapped form belonged to Atlantic cartography. The mapmaker did not have to invent the whole thing from nothing. He worked within a culture already prepared to believe that islands could exist beyond the western horizon. The Atlantic was not blank in European imagination. It had been filled for centuries with classical islands, holy islands, dangerous islands, fortunate islands, lost islands, and places that seemed to hover somewhere between geography and moral lesson. Ancient writers had described islands in the ocean. Medieval readers inherited those descriptions. Sailors added reports of real Atlantic archipelagos. Religious traditions added tales of exile and refuge. By the time Antillia appears with confidence on 15th century charts, the ocean west of Europe already had a long career as a place where the possible and the meaningful could easily be mistaken for each other. One reason legends became coastlines is that mapmakers often worked from layered information. They were not standing above the earth like a satellite, calmly checking each bay. They were compiling. A map could include first-hand sailing knowledge, older maps, written descriptions, travellers' accounts, classical authorities, local rumours, and the preferences of whoever was paying for the work. A piece of information might travel from a sailor to a merchant, from a merchant to a scholar to a cartographer, and then from one chart to another. At each stage, something could be added, simplified, misheard, translated, or made more regular. By the time the information reached parchment, it might look cleaner than its origin. A coastline has a way of tidying a rumour. It says, here is the boundary, even when the original report may have been no more precise than, there is said to be land somewhere beyond the islands. The transformation from story to coastline also depended on trust. Cartographers did not begin every map from the beginning of the world. They trusted sources. They copied respected models. They preserved features that appeared in earlier charts. This was not laziness. It was how knowledge moved. If a previous chart had proved useful in other ways, its uncertain features could benefit from the reliability of its accurate ones. Imagine a map that shows the coast of Portugal very well, the Canary Islands reasonably well, and Antillia confidently offshore. A later mapmaker who recognises the accuracy of the known coasts may be less eager to remove the western island. The chart has credibility. Some of that credibility spills over. A false island can travel under the protection of true coastlines, rather like a small child sneaking into a formal dinner by standing very close to a respectable uncle. The process was helped by the fact that mapmakers had to balance caution in two directions. Leaving out a place that might exist could be seen as a failure. Including a place that might not exist could also be a failure, but not always an obvious one. If no one had conclusively searched the area, a mission might feel too bold. Especially in an ocean where new islands were genuinely being found, the safest choice might be to include the reported island and let future sailors decide. This is one of the reasons phantom geography can linger. The unknown is not empty until it has been thoroughly checked, and in the 15th century Atlantic, thorough checking was difficult. Ships did not sweep the ocean in neat survey lines. Voyages had purposes, dangers, costs, and limits. Bad weather could send a vessel off course. Poor longitude could scramble positions. A captain might pass close to where an island was supposed to be and still return without a clean answer. The mapmaker back home would then be left with that most inconvenient of conclusions: maybe. There is also a deeper habit at work. Humans dislike blankness. We are not very comfortable with empty spaces on maps, especially when those spaces sit near areas we care about. A blank ocean can mean honest ignorance, but it can also feel like an accusation. It says you do not know what is here. Legends soften that discomfort. They provide content. They do not always provide accurate content, but they make the unknown more manageable. Antillia did exactly that. It gave the Western Atlantic a landmark, a story, and a kind of human scale. Instead of an enormous stretch of water, there was a possible island with cities, bishops, and a history. Even if uncertain, it made the Atlantic feel less like pure distance. It turned space into narrative, and narrative is easier to carry in the mind than raw emptiness. The Seven Cities legend was especially suited for cartographic survival because it had a simple internal order: 7 bishops, 7 settlements, 1 island. A mapmaker could turn that into a visual arrangement without needing much extra information. The island could be drawn long and broad. Bays could be placed along its coast. Names could be written beside them. The geometry did not have to be accurate because the legend itself supplied the organising principle. In this way, the map did not merely record the story, it translated the story into spatial form. The 7 cities were no longer only events in remembered time. They became locations in imagined space. That translation is powerful. Once a tale has been spatially arranged, viewers can inspect it as though it belongs to geography. They can ask how far away it is, which direction it lies, whether it might be reached from the Azores, whether it sits on the way to something else. A story with coordinates begins to attract practical questions, and practical questions can make a legend feel even more real. If someone asks whether Antillia could be reached from Portugal in a certain number of days, the question itself treats Antillia as a possible destination. If a ruler grants rights to discover or settle the island of 7 cities, the document treats it as a possible possession. If sailors discuss routes that might pass near it, the conversation treats it as a possible landfall. None of these actions proves the island exists, but each one adds social weight to the idea. Belief is not only a private feeling inside a person's head, it can be built into documents, maps, plans, and conversations. Antillia survived because it was not held by one person's imagination. It was held by a network of practices that made it look increasingly like a missing place rather than a fictional one. There is a useful comparison with other phantom islands. Some began as mistakes of observation. A cloud bank on the horizon could look like mountains. A mirage could lift a distant coast into view. Floating ice, volcanic haze, or unusual weather could mislead even experienced sailors. Other phantom islands may have been real islands placed in the wrong location, duplicated on maps because reports from different voyages were not recognised as referring to the same place. Still others were inherited from older texts and kept alive by respect for authority. Antillia probably drew strength from several of these mechanisms at once, but its religious legend made it different from a mere navigational mistake. It had emotional architecture. A cloud mistaken for land usually has no bishops. Antillia had 7, which made the whole business much harder to tidy away. The fact that legends could become coastlines should not make us think medieval mapmakers were gullible in some simple way. They were often highly skilled, and Portoland charts in particular could be remarkably effective for the waters they were designed to represent. The Mediterranean coastlines on many of these charts were drawn with impressive care. Mariners depended on them. The same technical culture that could preserve accurate coastal knowledge could also preserve uncertain Atlantic features, because the map was not divided into a neat modern boundary between verified and unverified data. There was no convenient layer you could turn off called probably mythical islands, though one imagines it would have been popular with cautious sailors and extremely unpopular with storytellers. Instead, different kinds of knowledge sat together on the same surface. Accuracy in one region did not guarantee accuracy in another, but the eye naturally read the whole map as a unified object. That unity could be misleading. When Antillia was drawn in the same visual language as known islands, it gained the appearance of belonging to the same category. The viewer saw coastline, colour, label, and relative placement. The island did not announce, "I am based on a legend and should be handled carefully after supper." It simply appeared. The visual grammar of the chart did not always explain degrees of certainty. Modern maps can use dotted lines, notes, shading, or labels such as disputed or approximate, and even then people misunderstand them. Older charts had their own conventions, but uncertainty was often less explicitly separated. If a feature was included, it occupied space. Occupying space is one of the main things places do. Antillia therefore looked like a place. The copying process could also smooth away hesitation. An early mapmaker might have included Antillia cautiously, based on uncertain reports or inherited legend. A later mapmaker, seeing it already drawn, might copy it with less visible doubt. After several generations of copying, the original uncertainty becomes hard to see. The island's presence on multiple charts can then be mistaken for multiple independent confirmations, when some of those charts may simply share a common ancestry. This is not only a medieval problem, it happens whenever information is repeated across sources without clear tracking of where it began. A claim appears in one article, then another, then a summary, then a diagram, and soon it feels widely supported, when really it is wearing several hats and pretending to be a crowd. Antillia wore many cartographic hats. There was also a commercial and cultural incentive to make maps that felt complete. A map with rich detail could be more impressive than one full of blankness. Patrons wanted useful charts, but they also valued knowledge, prestige, and the sense of possessing a world picture. In that setting, including known legendary islands could make a map feel more comprehensive. It showed that the mapmaker had access to traditions and reports beyond the ordinary. It suggested sophistication. This does not mean cartographers knowingly filled their maps with nonsense to please customers. It means the boundary between useful detail and questionable inherited material was not always obvious, and sometimes the safer or more attractive choice was to include more rather than less. A map that says, "I know many things," is often more appealing than a map that says, "I know where the coast ends and then I become very quiet." Antillia's coastline also benefited from the way islands function in imagination. Islands are perfect containers for stories. They have clear boundaries, they can hide communities, they can preserve old customs, they can be isolated from history, or so people like to think, although anyone who has lived on an island might point out that weather, trade, and neighbours still have opinions. In storytelling, an island can hold a lost people, a paradise, a monster, a monastery, a treasure, a prison, or a future colony. The sea around it explains why it has not been reached. The coastline explains where the story begins and ends. Antillia needed that container. The 7 cities required separation from Iberia, but not total impossibility. An island west of the known world provided just enough distance. The ocean kept the cities hidden. The map kept them imaginable. As the legend entered charts, it also became part of the expanding European habit of looking westward. Before the Americas were known to Europeans as continents across the Atlantic, the Western Ocean could absorb many expectations. Asia might be there if the world was smaller than some thought. Islands might lie along the route. Ancient authorities might have preserved hints of lands across the sea. Sailors might have glimpsed something. Driftwood, unfamiliar plants, or bodies washed ashore could be interpreted as signs of Western land. In such an atmosphere, Antillia was not isolated from broader speculation. It sat among other clues, hopes, and arguments. It helped make the West feel populated by possibility. The legend's religious content also changed the tone of that possibility. Antillia was not only a strange land, it was supposedly connected to Christian history. That made it familiar in a world where unfamiliar lands could raise difficult questions. Who lived there? What did they believe? Were they monstrous, noble, lost, dangerous, convertible, allied, or already Christian? The 7 cities story answered before the question became too troublesome. The inhabitants were Christians descended from Iberian refugees. They belonged in some imagined way to the same moral and historical universe as the people reading the map. That made the island more inviting than a completely unknown land. It was distant, but not alien. Hidden, but not incomprehensible. New, but also old. This combination is very attractive. It lets people imagine discovery without total strangeness. Once Antillia had a coastline, it could also be compared with real discoveries. As Portuguese and Spanish sailors learned more about the Atlantic, mapmakers had to fit old expectations around new facts. Sometimes a legendary place could be reinterpreted as a real one. Perhaps Antillia was one of the Azores, wrongly enlarged. Perhaps it was a garbled report of Madeira. Perhaps it was a memory of something farther west. Later, after Columbus, some would try to connect Antillia with the Caribbean. These identifications show how legends are not always abandoned when evidence changes. They are often relocated. People do not say the story was wrong. They say perhaps it referred to this. This is a very human maneuver, and it is not limited to old maps. We often rescue a belief by moving it slightly, changing its label, or deciding it was metaphorical after the literal version becomes inconvenient. For Antillia, the coastline was both a strength and a vulnerability. It helped the island become real to viewers, but it also made the island testable. A vague legend can survive forever because it has no precise location. A mapped island invites ships. The more specific the chart, the more embarrassing the absence becomes when voyagers fail to confirm it. In the beginning, the rectangle's confidence protected the story. Over time, that same confidence exposed it. If Antillia was really so large, why did ships not find it? If it had 7 cities, why did no one trade with them? If it lay in the western Atlantic, why did better navigation not pin it down? The coastline gave Antillia a body, and bodies can be looked for. Eventually the ocean's silence began to matter, but that silence took time to become decisive. During the period when Antillia was still being copied, Europe's Atlantic knowledge was uneven enough for the island to remain plausible. A chart could show known islands, newly found islands, uncertain islands, and legendary islands together because the process of sorting them had not finished. The coastline of Antillia sat in that unfinished sorting. It was not pure invention in the sense of a novelist deciding to entertain. It was not verified geography either. It was inherited possibility made visible. That is a subtle category, but a very important one. Many things people believe occupy that middle ground before evidence either strengthens or dissolves them. If we imagine the mapmaker drawing Antillia, we should not picture a villain of geography chuckling over a fake island while dipping his pen. More likely, we should picture someone working within the information world available to him. He has old stories, earlier charts, perhaps sailors' rumours, perhaps names associated with the island, perhaps a patron who expects the latest Atlantic knowledge. He draws the land because it belongs to the current picture of the Western Ocean. The coastline he creates is not a joke, it is a decision under uncertainty. That decision will be copied, questioned, adjusted, and eventually abandoned. But for a while, it will do what maps do. It will teach people how to imagine space. This is the quiet power of Antillia. It reminds us that maps do not only reflect exploration, they can also guide it. A drawn island can become a target. A named place can invite a voyage. A rumour with a coastline can move from conversation into ambition. The old legend of the Seven Cities did not sit passively on parchment. It suggested that the unknown West was worth searching. It contributed to a mental Atlantic filled with islands, refuges, routes, and hidden societies. Even if Antillia itself was never found, the expectation of Western land helped shape the atmosphere in which real voyages were planned. Not because everyone believed every old island story with equal seriousness, but because the boundary between known and unknown was active, negotiable, and full of promise. There is something almost tender about the way the legend became a coastline. It shows a culture trying to make sense of a widening world with the tools it had. Memory became shape, hope became label, uncertainty became a shore drawn in red or brown ink. The result was wrong in the narrow geographical sense, but it was revealing in every other sense. Antillia tells us what people feared losing, what they hoped survived, and how they imagined the ocean before the modern Atlantic took form in European knowledge. Its coastline was not the edge of real land, it was the edge of a story made visible, and once a story had become visible in this way, the next stage was repetition. Antillia did not endure because one chart happened to draw it. It endured because map after map gave it renewed permission to exist. The island moved through workshops, ports, collections, and royal imaginations, carried by the disciplined hands of cartographers who surrounded it with compass lines and familiar coasts. To see how a ghost island could look so professionally certain, we need to stay with those charts themselves, the Portolan maps that made Antillia not merely a legend with a coastline, but a navigational possibility placed calmly among the working knowledge of the sea. The Portolan charts gave Antillia its most convincing disguise. They did not look like the sort of maps made to entertain a bored nobleman after dinner, though they could certainly be beautiful enough for that. They looked useful. They looked disciplined. Their coastlines were crowded with names, their seas crossed by straight directional lines, their islands painted in careful colours, and their whole surface seemed to say that this was not a place for idle fantasy. This was a working picture of the sea. So when Antillia appeared on such a chart, it did not feel like a stray bedtime story wandering into the wrong room. It felt like part of a serious maritime world, drawn with the same hand that marked harbours, capes, reefs, and sailing directions. That quiet confidence may have been the island's greatest protection. A Portolan chart was, in many ways, one of the great practical achievements of medieval cartography. These charts began appearing in the Mediterranean world in the late 13th century, already showing highly developed conventions, detailed coastlines, dense names along the shore, and networks of compass or direction lines radiating across the sea. Unlike many symbolic medieval world maps, Portolans focus strongly on coastlines and navigation, especially in waters such as the Mediterranean and Black Sea, where sailors moved from port to port and needed to recognise land, harbours, and hazards with care. They were not designed primarily to answer deep theological questions or show where paradise might be tucked away, although one imagines a tired sailor would have appreciated that information as well. They were designed to help people move across water and survive the attempt. That practical reputation matters because Antillia entered through a door normally used by observation. On the 1424 nautical chart associated with Juan Pisagano, held today by the James Ford Bell Library at the University of Minnesota, the map is described as a portolan chart, a manuscript map emphasising the sea and the ports around its coastline, linked to written sailing directions known as portolani. It was hand-painted on parchment, with coastlines, port names, compass points and rum lines, and it included not only better-known Atlantic islands such as the Canaries and Madeira, but also legendary western Atlantic islands, including Antillia and Saturnales. This was the strange combination at the heart of the problem. The chart preserved real maritime knowledge, yet it also carried a large phantom island westward into the Atlantic, dressed in the same visual language as the rest. If you were looking at such a chart in the 15th century, you might not have had an easy way to separate the tested coast from the hopeful coastline. The map did not glow red around doubtful features. It did not politely whisper, "Please be cautious, this island may be more legend than land." It simply showed things. A known island might be painted beside a reported one. A real port might sit in the same web of lines as a mythical shore. The chart's calm surface flattened uncertainty. The viewer's eye could travel from Portugal to the Azores to Antillia without feeling a dramatic change in category. That is how a ghost island gained respectability. It borrowed the seriousness of the chart around it. Portolan charts had a special visual authority because of their dense and technical appearance. Their direction lines, often called rum lines or windrose lines, stretched across the sea in complex networks, radiating from compass centres and helping mariners think in terms of bearings. Their coastlines carried name after name, written close together along the shore, sometimes in different colours to mark important ports. Their makers often left the interiors of land comparatively empty because the chart cared less about inland mountains and more about where a ship could go. This selective attention made them feel honest in a particular way. They did not pretend to know everything. They cared about the edges where land meets sea, and Antillia, unfortunately for accuracy, had edges. There is something almost hypnotic about those old sea charts. The web of lines gives a sense of order, as if the sea has been tamed by geometry. A sailor could turn the chart, compare a course with a compass direction, and trace a line of travel. Modern historians still debate exactly how early portolan charts were made and how their remarkable coastal accuracy was achieved, but their practical maritime focus is clear. For familiar waters, this was not vague speculation. Generations of sailors had built knowledge through movement, memory, bearing, and repeated experience. So when a chart that looked so skilled included Antillia, it was easy for the island to inherit some of that trust, the way a very questionable guest at a wedding can seem respectable if seated at the table with the grandparents. The 1424 Pisagano chart is especially important because it is one of the earliest clear places where Antillia steps into this confident cartographic setting. The James Ford Bell Library notes that the chart's fame rests partly on what is often called the Antillia group, the improbably large islands in the western Atlantic, with Antillia shown in red and Saturnases in dark blue. That colour alone would have made the island stand out. It was not a faint uncertainty. It was visible, bold, and large. A viewer could hardly miss it, and because the surrounding chart carried real geographic information, the island did not look like an isolated invention. It looked like one element in a wider maritime picture. This is where the quiet confidence of portolan charts becomes almost dangerous. They were convincing not because they shouted, but because they did not need to. Their authority came from their practical restraint. They were full of careful coastal names and navigational structure. They seemed to have no time for nonsense. So if Antillia was there, one could reasonably think there must have been a reason. Perhaps a sailor had seen it. Perhaps an older source had recorded it. Perhaps it was newly reported, waiting to be confirmed. A good mapmaker would not simply invent a large Atlantic island, would he? That question would have helped Antillia survive, because people often trust professional caution even when they cannot see the evidence behind it. Of course, mapmakers were not working with nothing. They had the Seven Cities legend, older Atlantic island traditions, possibly sailors' reports, and earlier charting habits. They also had the pressure of a changing ocean. By the 15th century, Portolan charts had expanded beyond their Mediterranean heartland into the Atlantic, covering Western Europe, parts of North and West Africa, and islands that were newly known or newly discussed. The Atlantic was becoming more charted, but not yet fully known. That created a perfect environment for a place like Antillia. The chart's format demanded visible geography. The ocean offered uncertainty. The legend offered content. The result was a coastline with authority but no land beneath it. The copying of Antillia from chart to chart strengthened this impression. Once the island appeared in a respected model, later cartographers could repeat it, sometimes preserving its broad rectangular form, sometimes adjusting its bays, names, orientation, or companions. Antillia appears through a series of 15th century maps and globes, including works associated with Battista Beccario, Andrea Bianco, Gracioso Benincasa, Albino de Canepa, Martin Behaim, and others. This repetition made Antillia feel established. A viewer might not know whether these maps depended on one another. They might simply see the island again and again and assume that so many careful people could not all be repeating the same uncertainty. But that is exactly one of the ways uncertain knowledge becomes durable. It multiplies visually before it is verified physically. There is a quiet lesson here about the difference between independent evidence and copied evidence. If 10 sailors from 10 different voyages report the same island, that is one kind of support. If 10 mapmakers copy the same island from related sources, that is another. To a later viewer, the result may look similar. 10 appearances, one island. But the strength behind those appearances is completely different. Antillia's cartographic life depended heavily on the second kind. Its repetition may have reflected the authority of previous charts more than repeated observation. This is not a criticism of the mapmakers so much as a reminder of how information travels. A claim can become widespread without becoming well confirmed. It can become familiar without becoming true. It can become, in the most sleepy and inconvenient sense, a very well-dressed mistake. The Portolan tradition encouraged this because it was stable and recognizable. The same general style of chart could be used across regions and generations. Coastlines, compass roses, colour-coded lines and place names created a shared maritime visual language. A mapmaker working in Venice, Genoa, Majorca, or elsewhere could inherit conventions understood by sailors, patrons, and other cartographers. This stability was useful. It allowed knowledge to accumulate and move. But stability also makes copying natural. If a feature belongs to the accepted layout of the Atlantic, removing it is a stronger act than preserving it. The island that remains has inertia. Antillia did not need every cartographer to believe with enthusiasm. It only needed enough of them not to erase it. There were also material reasons for the impression of certainty. Portolan charts were often made on parchment or vellum, hand-painted, and sometimes rolled for storage aboard ships. These were crafted objects. They took skill and time. Their surfaces were not casual. When a place appeared on such a thing, it gained the dignity of labour. Someone had prepared the skin, drawn the lines, written the names, applied the colours, and fitted the place into a complex design. The effort itself could make the result feel trustworthy. We are still vulnerable to this. A claim in a polished chart, a beautiful infographic, or a well-designed interface feels more reliable than the same claim scribbled on a napkin, even if the napkin happens to be right and the infographic is wearing very expensive shoes. The Pizzigano chart's survival also lets us see how real and legendary islands could share the same oceanic surface. The chart depicts Western Europe, Northwestern Africa, England and Ireland, and Atlantic islands known or emerging in European awareness, while also including legendary islands such as Brazil and the Antillia group. This mixture was not necessarily contradictory to its makers. It reflected a world where the Atlantic contained different degrees of knowledge. Some islands had been visited, some were reported, some were inherited from old traditions, some were debated. The chart gathered them together because the mapmaker's task was not always to separate certainty from possibility with modern sharpness. It was to represent the maritime world as available knowledge and expectation had shaped it. For sailors, this mixture could be useful and frustrating at the same time. A chart might help them navigate along familiar coasts while also showing a distant island they would never find. That does not mean the chart was useless. It means the chart was uneven, like most knowledge systems before complete verification. Even today, a single map can contain exact roads, outdated business names, approximate trails, disputed borders, and a restaurant that closed 3 years ago but remains spiritually alive in someone's database. The Portolan chart was more beautiful, and perhaps less likely to recommend a disappointing sandwich, but the principle is familiar. Maps often carry layers of certainty together. Antillia's position within these charts also mattered visually. It was not tucked into a decorative corner, harmless and symbolic. It sat in the ocean, west of Iberia, in a space that a ship might theoretically cross. The island therefore participated in navigational imagination. A sailor could look at the chart and imagine courses, distances, and possible landfalls. Even if the island was not directly used for a voyage, its presence changed the mental shape of the Atlantic. The west was not only open water, it had a large island with bays and settlements. It had a possible pause in the blue. For anyone thinking about oceanic travel, that possibility mattered. The confidence of Portolan charts was especially persuasive because their errors were not always obvious. Along familiar coasts, they could be impressively accurate. Along less familiar horizons, they could absorb rumour. The viewer might not know where the chart shifted from observation to tradition. A coastline drawn with skill in one region trained the eye to trust the next coastline. Antillia benefited from that transition. If the coast of Iberia looked right and the Canaries looked recognisable, then the island farther west appeared under the same spell of competence. The chart did not ask the viewer to judge each feature separately. It presented a world. This did not mean every user believed in Antillia in the same way. Some may have treated it as a reported island, some as a legendary one, some as a possibility worth checking. Some may barely have noticed it, especially if their sailing took them nowhere near the Western Atlantic. Belief is often practical. A fisherman near the coast of Catalonia did not need to have a strong opinion about Antillia before breakfast. A Portuguese courtier interested in Western voyages might care much more. A cartographer might include the island because his sources did. A sailor might hope for it, because an island at sea is better than no island at all, unless it turns out to be surrounded by rocks, in which case one's enthusiasm should be moderated. The maps also helped standardise Antillia's companions. Satanazes, Roilo or Imana, and Tanmar or Saya often appear in connection with the island group, creating the sense that Antillia belonged to a little Atlantic archipelago rather than standing alone. This clustering is important. A single, uncertain island can look lonely and questionable. A group looks more like a report. It suggests relationships, distances, and a larger discovery. If Antillia was one island among several, perhaps someone had not merely glimpsed land but had knowledge of a whole region. That impression made the ghost more substantial. It gave the phantom a neighbourhood, which is a dangerous thing for phantoms to have. The names themselves were part of the confidence. Labels on maps have a quiet magic. They turn shapes into places. A coastline without a name may be a form. A coastline with a name becomes something that has entered language. Antillia, Satanazes, Roilo, Tanmar. These names sound like things that have been passed through mouths, reports and manuscripts. Some may have shifted from earlier forms, been mistranscribed, or been adapted by mapmakers working in different languages. That instability did not necessarily weaken their effect. Old map names often varied. Even real places could have multiple spellings, so a strange name did not automatically mark a place as false. It simply made it feel distant, foreign, and perhaps badly pronounced by someone leaning over a candle. There is also the matter of decoration. Portolan charts could be practical, but they were not visually plain. Many included flags, city images, rulers, animals, religious symbols, and carefully coloured islands, especially in later elaborate examples intended for elite users. This mixture of utility and beauty complicates our modern expectations. A chart could serve navigation and display at the same time. It could preserve practical routes while also showing the owner's learning, status, and command of distant knowledge. Antillia fitted well into that dual function. As a navigational possibility, it mattered to the sea. As a legendary island, it enriched the map's story of the world. It was useful even if it was not true, because usefulness on a map can include imagination, prestige, and inherited memory. The Portolan surface therefore gave Antillia several forms of support at once. Its geometry made the island look placed. Its style made it look professional. Its repetition made it look established. Its labels made it look named. Its companion islands made it look regional. Its connection to the 7 cities made it look inhabited. None of these forms of support proved anything in the ocean, but together they formed a convincing paper reality. That is perhaps the best phrase for Antillia in this stage. Paper reality. It existed in ink, parchment, and expectation. It could be pointed to, it could be discussed, it could be granted in royal language, searched for, and copied. A thing can have consequences before it has coordinates. Over time, however, the same charting tradition that preserved Antillia also made its failure more visible. As Atlantic navigation improved and voyages increased, the empty spaces became less forgiving. Islands that existed could be visited, named more clearly, claimed, settled, and measured. Islands that did not exist had to retreat into ambiguity. Antillia's neatness became a problem. Its large size made it harder to excuse. Its repeated placement invited comparison with actual routes. The more practical knowledge grew, the more the island's borrowed confidence began to fade. The Portolan chart had helped Antillia look real, but real sailing would eventually ask a blunt question. If it is there, why does nobody arrive? Still, before that question became too loud, Antillia enjoyed a long period of calm authority. It sat on charts not as a wild fantasy, but as a respectable uncertainty. That is the important distinction. Its presence was not a failure of map-making alone. It was a feature of an information world where coastlines could come from observation, rumour, inheritance, and hope, all processed through the same skilled hands. The quiet confidence of Portolan charts did not create Antillia from nothing, but it gave the island its most persuasive costume. Without those charts, the 7 cities might have remained only a legend. With them, the legend had a coast, a colour, a position, and a chance to be taken seriously by people who were beginning to look west with increasing ambition. From that point, the story naturally moves away from the mapmaker's desk and back toward the sea itself. Because charts do not live only in libraries, they belong to sailors, pilots, merchants, patrons, and all the people whose reports, fears, mistakes, and hopes pass from ship to shore and then into ink. To understand why Antillia held its place for so long, we have to listen to the human traffic around it, the rumours carried between ports, the uncertain sightings, the promises of western land, and the strange geography of hope that made a missing island feel for a while like something just beyond the next horizon. To understand why Antillia stayed alive for so long, we have to leave the mapmaker's table for a while and walk down toward the harbour. Maps may look quiet when they are stored in libraries, But the information inside them was often noisy before it became ink. It came from sailors arguing over distances, pilots remembering currents, merchants repeating what they had heard in another port, royal officials listening for opportunity, and travellers trying to make sense of clouds, birds, driftwood, unfamiliar currents, and the endless habit of the sea to suggest things just beyond sight. Antillia did not survive only because cartographers copied it. It survived because the Atlantic world around those cartographers was full of rumour, and rumour, when mixed with hope, can be almost as buoyant as a ship. For a sailor in the 15th century, the ocean was not an empty blue surface waiting to be measured. It was a working environment filled with signs. Birds might suggest nearby land. Floating wood might hint at forests somewhere beyond the horizon. Strange plants washing ashore could be treated as messages from an unseen coast. Currents and winds had personalities, or at least they behaved stubbornly enough that sailors may as well have given them names and blamed them for delays. The sea was red, not simply crossed. It offered clues, but not always honest ones. A bank of clouds could sit low on the horizon and look like hills. A mirage could lift shapes into the air. A distant island could appear in distorted form and then vanish when approached. Even real land could be mislocated if the voyage had been long, the weather poor, and the calculations uncertain. In such a world, a report of western land did not automatically sound ridiculous. It sounded like the kind of thing the sea might reveal, conceal, and then deny, because the sea has always had a talent for being unhelpful at exactly the wrong moment. This is why sailors' rumours mattered so much. A mapmaker in a port city did not need to invent every island himself. He could inherit islands through conversation. Ships came in carrying cargo, tired crews, repairs to be made, and stories that had grown during the voyage. Some stories were practical. A dangerous shoal, a reliable wind, a harbour with good water, a coast where trade could be made. Others were more uncertain. A shape seen at sunset, an island said to exist beyond another island, a landfall made by someone's cousin's captain's previous employer, which is not the strongest chain of evidence, but has probably launched more conversations than we would like to admit. In a maritime culture, talk moved quickly. Ports were not only places where goods were exchanged, they were information markets. A rumour could travel from ship to tavern, from tavern to warehouse, from warehouse to court, and from court to parchment, perhaps gaining a little confidence at each stop, the way a small snowball becomes a respectable inconvenience by the time it reaches the bottom of a hill. Antillia fitted neatly into this world of seaborne possibility. The island was said to lie far west of Portugal and Spain, and it appeared repeatedly on 15th century nautical charts after its clear appearance on the 1424 Pizzigano chart. It was connected with the legend of the Isle of Seven Cities, and later sources described sightings or near-sightings, including a claim on Martin Baheim's 1492 globe that a Spanish vessel had sighted the island in 1414. That detail is important not because it proves the island existed, but because it shows how the legend gathered the kind of supporting material that a maritime audience might take seriously. A sighting by a vessel sounds different from a story told by a monk. It gives the island the smell of salt water. It suggests that someone out there, at some time, saw something. And when people want to believe in a place, someone saw something can be enough to keep the door open. The problem, of course, is that sailors really did see things that were not what they thought. The ocean encourages misinterpretation. Low clouds can look like mountains, especially after days at sea when every mind aboard would prefer land to remain a practical option. Sea fog can reveal and hide shapes in a way that feels almost deliberate. Volcanic islands, when first seen from far away, can appear larger or stranger than they are. Birds may fly far from land. Floating vegetation may travel long distances. Even a simple navigational error can move a real island into the wrong place on a chart. If one crew reported land at one position, and another reported land at a different position, a mapmaker might not know whether these were two separate islands, one island misplaced, or no island at all, and if he chose to include both, he might accidentally create a small archipelago of mistakes, which is rather efficient, though not ideal. This does not mean sailors were foolish. Quite the opposite. Experienced mariners were often extremely observant because their lives depended on it. But observation at sea is difficult. A sailor does not look from above, calmly checking coordinates with a satellite. He looks from a moving deck, through weather, fatigue, fear, glare, and the limits of instruments. He estimates. He remembers. He compares with what others have said. He may be excellent at navigating a known coast and still uncertain in an open ocean, where longitude is troublesome and the next confirmed landmark may be far away. So when a report came back from the west, it arrived with a mixture of credibility and doubt. The mapmaker had to decide what to do with that mixture. Antillia lived inside such mixtures. Hope made the mixture stronger. The Atlantic was frightening, but it was also full of promise. For Iberian sailors and rulers, western islands were not merely curiosities. They could mean harbours, fresh water, timber, fish, land for settlement, routes to trade, and strategic advantage. The discovery and colonisation of real Atlantic islands had shown that the ocean could reward persistence. Madeira, the Azores, the Canaries, and Cape Verde helped make the Atlantic feel like a space where islands were not just possible but expected. By the 15th century, Portoland charts had expanded beyond the Mediterranean into the Atlantic, supporting the wider movement of exploration that would lead Europeans farther down Africa's coast and eventually across the ocean. In that context, a rumoured island west of the Azores did not feel like pure fantasy. It felt like one more possibility in a sea that was already producing surprises. This is the geography of hope. It is not geography in the strict modern sense. It does not begin with verified surveys and end with clean coordinates. It begins with desire. People hoped for land because land meant safety. They hoped for islands because islands could extend routes. They hoped for Christian communities beyond the sea because such communities would make the unknown feel less alien. They hoped for wealth because voyages were expensive, and patrons preferred returns on investment, which remains one of the less romantic but more reliable engines of exploration. Antillia gathered several hopes at once. It might be a refuge, it might be inhabited, it might be useful, it might confirm old stories, it might offer ports, it might even hold riches. A place that satisfies many hopes can remain persuasive long after the evidence should have become embarrassing. The Portuguese interest in the island shows how hope could enter official life. In 1475, King Afonso V of Portugal granted Fernão Teles rights, connected with the 7 cities and any other populated islands he might find in the Atlantic, and in 1486 King João II authorised Fernão Dulmo to search for the island of 7 cities. These documents are a remarkable window into the period. They do not prove that the kings believed with perfect certainty that Antillia existed. Royal grants could be made over uncertain lands because the unknown was cheap to promise and potentially valuable if found. But they do show that the island was plausible enough to be folded into plans of exploration and reward. It had crossed from rumour into administration. Somewhere, someone had to write it down in the language of rights and privileges. That is a strange promotion for a phantom island. One can imagine the conversations behind such grants. A sailor or pilot reports old stories of Western land. A noble or entrepreneur sees opportunity. A ruler already engaged in Atlantic expansion decides that if there are populated islands out there, it is better for them to be found under Portuguese authority than by someone else. The costs and risks can be shifted to ambitious men willing to sail. If they find nothing, the kingdom has lost little. If they find an island, the crown gains a claim. This is a practical arrangement, but it rests on the imaginative map already in people's heads. Antillia becomes a place worth searching for because enough people can picture it. A coastline on a chart, a legend of 7 cities, and a few maritime rumours together become almost a business proposal. Rumour also worked because it did not always claim too much at once. A sailor did not have to say, "I visited Antillia, measured every street, and had a long conversation with the mayor about drainage." That would invite questions. It was often enough to say that land had been sighted from afar, or that another crew had come close, or that inhabitants had been encountered in some earlier voyage now difficult to verify. Later accounts linked Antillia with stories of Portuguese-speaking inhabitants descended from refugees, including a report preserved by the 16th century writer Antonio Galvão, that a Portuguese ship had reached the island in 1447 and met people who said they had fled during the time of King Roderick. Such reports are historically uncertain, but they show how the island's legend was made to sound like contact history. The story did not remain safely ancient. It acquired supposed recent encounters, which refreshed belief. That refreshing was important. Old legends can fade if they are not occasionally tied to new claims. Antillia's medieval origin gave it depth, but sailors' rumours gave it immediacy. The legend said the island had been settled long ago. Reports of sightings said it might still be there now. Together they bridged past and present. A hidden Christian community was not merely something that had once been imagined. It was something a ship might meet tomorrow if the wind behaved and nobody forgot the biscuits. That possibility made the island exciting without making it completely absurd. There is also a psychological element that should not be overlooked. At sea, hope is practical. A crew far from land may want to believe in an island for reasons that are not abstract at all. Land means water, repairs, food, rest, and a horizon that stops moving. A rumoured island can become a mental support, even when no one fully trusts it. Pilots and captains had to be cautious, but they also operated in an environment where morale mattered. The idea that land lay somewhere ahead could shape how a voyage was discussed and remembered. If a crew saw clouds at sunset after days of expectation, the mind might lean toward land. Not because sailors were weak, but because perception is never entirely separate from need. Anyone who has stared into the refrigerator hoping for cake knows this principle on a smaller and less heroic scale. Port cities amplified these needs into stories. Lisbon, Seville, Genoa, Venice, Mallorca, and other maritime centres were filled with people whose livelihoods depended on ships and information. A rumour about an island could interest merchants, pilots, mapmakers, clerics, and officials for different reasons. One person might hear religious significance, another might hear commercial opportunity, another might hear navigational advantage, another might simply hear a good story and repeat it because evenings are long and not every conversation can be about rope. Once a rumour served several audiences, it became harder to kill. Each group had its own reason for preserving it, even if none had proof. Antillia's name and identity also allowed it to connect with other Western Island traditions. The Atlantic was already home to legendary places such as Brazil or High Brazil, St. Brendan's Island, the Fortunate Isles, and other elusive lands that appeared in texts and maps. These places did not all come from the same tradition, but they shared a broad imaginative environment. The Western Ocean as a storehouse of islands that were hidden, blessed, dangerous, distant, or difficult to reach. Antillia entered this family with a particularly Iberian and Christian story, but it did not stand alone. A sailor or map viewer who had heard of one mysterious western island would not find another impossible. The ocean was already rumoured to contain such things. Antillia was one more named possibility among several. This clustering of phantom geography can create a feedback loop. If one legendary island is believed possible, another becomes easier to accept. If multiple charts show several western islands, the whole region starts to seem island-rich. Reports of one place may be confused with reports of another. Names may shift. A sighting meant for one island may be attached to a different one. The result is a crowded imaginary Atlantic, where each island lends atmosphere to the others. Antillia's companions on charts, including islands such as Setenazes, Roilo and Tanmar in various forms, helped create that sense of a Western archipelago of possibility. A single ghost might be questioned. A group of ghosts looks almost like a community, which is rude of them but effective. Hope also shaped how people interpreted failure. When ships did not find Antillia, that did not immediately disprove it. Perhaps the island was farther west. Perhaps the map's scale was wrong. Perhaps fog hid it. Perhaps the sailors had passed north or south. Perhaps the island had been confused with another. Perhaps God had concealed it, which is a difficult argument to answer with a compass. This flexibility allowed the island to survive unsuccessful searches and absent evidence. A belief that can explain failure as easily as success is very durable. Not always reliable, but durable. Antillia's defenders did not need to win every argument. They only needed enough uncertainty to keep the question open. For rulers and explorers, the possibility of Antillia also had strategic value. A populated island in the Atlantic could serve as a base or a claim. If its inhabitants were Christian and descended from Iberian refugees, then contact with them could be framed not as conquest but as reunion or protection. That framing mattered. It made the island morally appealing. It was not an unknown land full of unknown people. It was a lost extension of a familiar world. That made it easier to imagine approaching, claiming, organising and incorporating it. In this sense, the Seven Cities story softened the Atlantic frontier. It gave expansion a comforting face, though history reminds us that comforting faces can still be attached to very sharp ambitions. There is a gentle sadness in this. Antillia's hope was partly built from older loss. The legend began with flight from conquest, with communities leaving a broken homeland. Later, that same legend became part of an outward-looking expansionist world. A story of refuge became a story of search. A hidden island of survival became a possible object of royal grant. This does not make the legend hypocritical. It makes it human. Stories change when the people using them change. The island that comforted one generation might tempt another. Antillia could be both a memory of vulnerability and a tool of ambition. Many historical ideas live double lives like that, wearing soft slippers in one century and boots in the next. The sailors in this story were not merely carriers of error. They were carriers of uncertainty, and uncertainty is the natural material from which exploration is made. Without rumours, some voyages might never have been imagined. Without speculation, rulers might not have funded searches. Without hope, sailors might not have endured journeys into poorly known waters. Of course, hope could mislead. It could put phantom islands on maps and send ships after coastlines that did not exist. But it could also push people into discovering real lands, real currents, real routes and real limits. The same mental energy that preserved Antillia helped drive the wider mapping of the Atlantic. Error and discovery were not always separate paths. Sometimes they shared the same deck. By the end of the 15th century, the geography of hope began to change. Columbus's voyages opened European awareness of lands far beyond the old Atlantic island myths, though at first those lands were interpreted through existing expectations of Asia and islands. Antillia did not disappear immediately. Instead, it began to be reinterpreted. Some mapmakers reduced it, moved it, or allowed its name to migrate toward the Caribbean Antilles. This is exactly what durable legends often do when reality arrives. They do not simply vanish in embarrassment. They adapt, relocate, or leave their names behind. Antillia, as a large rectangular island in the mid-Atlantic, faded, but Antillia, as an echo, remained. That echo tells us why the island mattered. It was not only a mistake on a map, it was a container for hopes that belonged to a particular moment in Atlantic history. Sailors hoped for land, rulers hoped for claims, mapmakers hoped to preserve the best available knowledge. Religious memory hoped that something lost had survived. Merchants hoped for opportunity. Viewers hoped the unknown had structure. Antillia gathered all of that and gave it a western shore. It was a geography made from desire as much as from report. And perhaps this is why phantom islands are so strangely restful to think about, even when they are historically confusing. They remind us that people before us looked at the world with incomplete information, just as we do. Though our instruments are shinier and less likely to smell of tar, they listened, guessed, copied, doubted, hoped, and drew. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes they were wrong in ways that reveal what mattered to them. Antillia's absence from the ocean does not make it empty as a historical object. The island was missing, but the hopes around it were real. As the old reports moved through ports and charts, Antillia became one member of a wider family of places that hovered between belief and geography. It belonged with other islands that appeared on maps, invited speculation, resisted confirmation, and then slowly faded as exploration tightened the net. To see Antillia clearly, we have to place it beside those companions: Atlantis, Brazil, St. Brendan's Island, Saturnazes, and the long procession of phantom lands that filled the Atlantic imagination, before the ocean became familiar enough to disappoint them. Antillia was never alone. Not really. It may have had its own peculiar shape, its own 7 cities, and its own Iberian story of flight and survival, but it belonged to a much larger family of imagined lands that crowded the Atlantic for centuries. These were islands that appeared in stories before they appeared on maps, or appeared on maps before anyone could explain how they had been found, or appeared in both places so often that people stopped asking which came first. They formed a kind of floating population of the unknown: Atlantis, High Brazil, St. Brendan's Island, Saturnazes, the Isle of Demons, and many others, each with its own habits, moods, and talent for not being where sailors expected it to be. Antillia was one ghost among many, and to understand why it seemed plausible, we have to understand the haunted ocean it lived in. The Atlantic did not become a blank space in European imagination simply because it was difficult to cross. Quite the opposite. Difficulty made it more available to the imagination. The farther a place lay beyond regular experience, the more easily it could hold stories. A nearby field can only get away with so much before someone walks over and checks it. A distant ocean can shelter legends for generations, especially if the ships sent into it are few, the reports inconsistent, and the weather uncooperative. The Western Sea was large enough to hold fear, theology, classical memory, commercial ambition, and several islands that behaved like shy cats, appearing when they pleased and vanishing when approached. That was the world in which Antillia made sense. It was not an isolated mistake. It was part of a long habit of placing meaningful lands beyond the edge of reliable knowledge. The oldest and most famous member of this family is Atlantis, though Atlantis was not the same kind of phantom island as Antillia. Antillia appeared on navigational charts as a possible Atlantic landmass. Atlantis began as a literary and philosophical story in Plato's dialogues, especially Timaeus and Critias, where it was described as a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient gateway associated with the Strait of Gibraltar. Britannica summarizes the core tradition. Plato's Atlantis was said to lie beyond those pillars and was used in his dialogues as part of a story about an idealized conflict and the dangers of pride, power, and moral decline. In other words, Atlantis was not introduced as a sailor's report in the ordinary sense. It was a moral and political tale given a geographic stage. But geography has a way of escaping its original purpose. Once a story says that a great island lay beyond Gibraltar, listeners begin to ask where it was. Was it in the Atlantic? Was it a memory of some real disaster? Was it connected to volcanic eruptions, drowned lands, ancient seafaring, or a civilization lost beneath the waves? These questions have followed Atlantis for more than 2,000 years, and they show how powerful a named island can become once it is given a position near the edge of the known world. Plato may have used Atlantis for philosophical reasons, but later readers often treated it as a possible clue to ancient geography. The island became a magnet for speculation. It was not usually drawn on port or land charts in the same practical way as Antillia, but it helped prepare the imagination for the idea that the Atlantic might conceal lost lands, ruined civilizations, and places whose absence only made them more interesting. Antillia and Atlantis share a family resemblance, but they are not twins. Atlantis is grand, ancient, catastrophic, and moralizing. It sinks or is destroyed and becomes a warning. Antillia is more modest and more administratively believable, if one can call a ghost island modest, while it is the size of a small country. Its story is not about the arrogance of an empire. It is about bishops and followers escaping conquest and founding cities across the sea. Atlantis looks backward to a vanished power. Antillia looks sideways toward a hidden continuation. Atlantis is gone because it was punished or destroyed. Antillia is missing because it is concealed, misplaced, or unreachable. That difference matters. A lost continent can become a myth of disaster. A hidden island can remain a destination. Then there is High Brazil, one of Antillia's closest cousins in the strange household of Atlantic phantom islands. High Brazil, or Brazil, was commonly imagined west of Ireland, though its mapped position wandered over time with the casual confidence of someone rearranging furniture in the dark. The Library of Congress has shown examples of early modern maps placing Brazil in different locations, including Diego Gutierrez's 1562 map and Abraham Ortelius's 1570 map, where an island named Brazil appears west of Ireland. In Irish tradition, High Brazil was often described as a mysterious island hidden by mist, visible only rarely, sometimes once every 7 years, and difficult or impossible to reach. That detail gives it a different emotional flavour from Antillia. Antillia was hidden by distance, uncertainty, and the limits of navigation. High Brazil was hidden almost by temperament. It was the island equivalent of someone peeking through the curtains and then pretending not to be home. High Brazil's cartographic life was long and stubborn. It appeared again and again under various names and positions, often circular and sometimes divided by a central channel or river. Its endurance shows that a phantom island did not need a single fixed form to survive. In fact, flexibility could help. If one location failed, another might do. If a later map adjusted its position, the island could continue under a new arrangement. The name persisted even as the shape and location shifted. This is an important contrast with Antillia. Antillia's strength lay partly in its recognisable rectangular form and seven-city story. High Brazil's strength lay in its folklore and its ability to drift. One ghost stayed persuasive by looking orderly. The other stayed persuasive by remaining elusive. St. Brendan's Island adds another branch to the family tree. It was connected to St. Brendan of Clonfert, an Irish monastic figure associated with legendary voyages in the Atlantic. Britannica describes St. Brendan as a Celtic saint and monastic founder who became the hero of Atlantic voyage legends, and the Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abertis, recorded in Latin prose sometime between the mid-8th and early 10th century, tells of Brendan's astonishing sea journey in a small boat. The Library of Congress notes that St. Brendan's Island appeared in different locations on historical maps of the Atlantic, often west of England and Ireland, and sometimes farther south near the Canary Islands. This wandering location is familiar by now. Phantom islands often had the manners of polite but unreliable guests, always expected, never quite in the chair assigned to them. St. Brendan's Island was especially powerful because it came from the Christian voyage tradition. Medieval Irish sea tales, or imrama, were not simple travellogues. They mixed pilgrimage, testing, marvels, spiritual instruction, and oceanic adventure. A saint sailing westward through strange islands and holy trials gave the Atlantic a sacred dimension. The sea was not just space. It was a route through moral and spiritual experience. Antillia's legend also had Christian roots, but in a different way. Brendan's Island was tied to quest and wonder. Antillia was tied to exile and settlement. Brendan sails, discovers, endures, and returns in story. The bishops of Antillia sail, settle, and cut themselves off. One island belongs to pilgrimage, the other belongs to refuge. Both show how Christian imagination placed meaningful land in the Atlantic long before the ocean was fully charted by European sailors. This is why the family of Phantom Islands is not just a list of mistakes, it is a map of mental needs. Atlantis gave the ocean a lost ancient power. High Brazil gave it a supernatural island of mist and rare visibility. St. Brendan's Island gave it a sacred destination shaped by voyage and testing. Antillia gave it a hidden Christian society founded after disaster. Saturnases, Antillia's dark companion on some maps, added a more ominous note. Its name has often been read as connected with devils or demons, and on the Pizzigano chart it appears near Antillia as part of the same Western Atlantic island group. Later maps sometimes changed its name or replaced its role, and scholars have connected it with the broader Atlantic tradition of frightening islands and demonic places. The group therefore contained both refuge and danger, Christian cities and threatening shores. The unknown ocean could be safe, holy, cursed, wealthy, or all of those depending on which island your eye landed on first. The Isle of Demons, associated with the North Atlantic near Newfoundland and Labrador in later European maps, shows how easily fear could become geography. The Canadian Centre for Architecture notes that around the beginning of the 16th century, an island with that foreboding name appeared on European world maps near those coasts, said to be occupied by evil spirits. This kind of island served a different function from Antillia. It did not invite a hopeful reunion with lost Christians. It warned. It made danger visible. When sailors feared a region, stories could gather into place names. A dangerous coast might be given a dangerous island. A haunted report might become a mapped warning. To us, the name may sound theatrical, but to someone crossing cold, unfamiliar waters in a wooden ship, the difference between metaphor and practical caution was perhaps less important than getting home with all limbs and most of the cruise patients intact. Many Phantom Islands arose from the same basic ingredients: uncertain observation, old story, copying and desire. But each island mixed those ingredients differently. Some were mostly literary. Some were mostly religious. Some were mostly navigational mistakes. Some were possibly misplacements of real islands. Others may have come from optical illusions, mistranslations, duplicated reports, or deliberate exaggerations. A phantom island is not one phenomenon. It is a family of phenomena wearing similar clothes. Antillia's case is so useful because we can see several forces at work together. It had an old Iberian legend. It had a strong cartographic shape. It appeared in professional charts. It attracted royal attention. It sat in an ocean already crowded with other island traditions. It was therefore not a flimsy rumour. It was a braided thing, and braided things are harder to pull apart. The family resemblance becomes clearer when we think about islands as containers. An island has boundaries, which makes it perfect for holding a story. A continent is too large and complicated. A coastline may go on too long, but an island can be imagined as a complete world. It can hold a lost people, an ideal society, a saint's paradise, a cursed shore, a treasure, a monastery, a monster, or a city where everyone is strangely organised and probably very proud of their local bread. Its separation by water explains why it has remained different. Its shore explains how it might be reached. Its isolation explains why reports are rare. This made islands ideal tools for medieval and early modern imagination. The mapmaker could draw a boundary, and the storyteller could fill it. Antillia's boundary was unusually crisp, but it shared that island logic. The sea around it protected the 7 cities from ordinary history. The coastline gave those cities a container. The distance from Iberia explained why no one had regular contact. The old legend explained why the inhabitants were Christian. The map explained where they might be. Each part did useful work. High Brazil's mist performed a similar function. It explained why the island could be known and yet unreachable. St. Brendan's Island could shift because its purpose was not stable navigation but spiritual marvel. Atlantis could sink because its meaning was tied to destruction and memory. The Isle of Demons could frighten because its very name carried warning. These islands were not interchangeable. They were members of the same family, but each had its own job. There is also a chronological layering to this family. Classical antiquity gave the Atlantic some of its oldest imaginative structures, including Atlantis and the Fortunate Isles. Christian medieval traditions added saints' voyages, blessed islands, hidden communities, and moralized landscapes. Norse and Irish traditions added their own Western memories and voyage tales. Iberian Atlantic experience added stories shaped by the Reconquista, real island discoveries, and the practical search for routes. Then the age of exploration placed all of this under new pressure. Old stories did not simply disappear when sailors gained better ships and better charts. For a while, the opposite happened. More exploration meant more reports, and more reports could feed old expectations. The ocean became both more known and more crowded with rumour at the same time. It is rather like cleaning out a drawer and somehow finding more loose keys than before. Progress can be untidy. This is why the discovery of real Atlantic islands did not immediately kill the phantom ones. In some ways, it strengthened them. If Madeira was real, if the Azores were real, if the Canaries were real, then why not Antillia? Why not another island farther west? The confirmation of some islands made the existence of others more plausible. Reality gave imagination a boost. That may sound backwards, but it happens often. One surprising discovery can make people more willing to believe the next surprising claim. The unknown seems generous. If the sea has already produced unexpected land, perhaps it has more in reserve. So the real islands of the Atlantic helped create an atmosphere in which ghost islands could stand beside them without immediate embarrassment. The Phantom family also shows how maps preserved cultural memory. Atlantis preserved a classical moral geography. St. Brendan's Island preserved Christian voyage literature. High Brazil preserved Celtic island folklore. Antillia preserved Iberian memory of conquest and exile. Satanazes and the Isle of Demons preserved fear and warning. When these places appeared on maps, the chart became more than a navigational object. It became a gathering place for different kinds of past. A sailor might use part of it for direction, a scholar might read part of it as inherited learning, and a patron might admire the whole thing as a world rich with possibility. The map was doing several jobs at once, and Phantom Islands slipped in because they helped with some of those jobs, even when they failed the strict test of being land. There is a temptation to laugh at this, gently perhaps, but still to laugh. We might say, how charming, they put imaginary islands on serious maps. But the more useful response is recognition. We still live with imagined geographies. They may not be drawn as islands in the Atlantic, but we carry mental maps of places we have never checked, communities we misunderstand, risks we exaggerate, opportunities we hope for, and blank spaces we fill with inherited stories. Our maps are better now, technically extraordinary, constantly updated and very rarely troubled by islands that vanish for 7 years at a time. But our minds still place certainty where there is only repetition. We still give names to hopes. We still let fear draw coastlines. Antillia's family is old, but the habit behind it is not. The comparison with Atlantis is useful here because it shows two very different paths to longevity. Atlantis survives because it asks enormous questions. Can civilizations vanish? Can power destroy itself? Can ancient memory preserve catastrophe? Antillia survives in historical imagination because it asks quieter questions. How does a rumour become a coastline? How does a legend become policy? How does a map make the uncertain look settled? Atlantis became famous because it was dramatic. Antillia is fascinating because it was almost believable. A sunken super-civilization is grand. A rectangular island with 7 Christian cities west of Portugal is oddly bureaucratic, and that is precisely what makes it so instructive. It entered the machinery of cartography and exploration not as an obvious fantasy, but as a plausible item in an unfinished ocean. High Brazil and St. Brendan's Island help explain Antillia's staying power in another way. They show that disappearance itself can become part of an island's identity. If an island is said to be hidden by mist or visible only rarely or spiritually accessible, then failure to find it does not necessarily end the story. It may even confirm the story's special nature. Antillia was less magical than High Brazil, but it too benefited from distance and uncertainty. The farther west the island lay, the easier it was to explain missing it. The more inconsistent the reports, the more room there was for adjustment. Phantom islands are not always destroyed by absence, because absence is already part of their atmosphere. They are expected to be difficult. That difficulty becomes their defence. Over time, however, the family thinned. Better navigation, repeated voyages, improved charts, colonial mapping, and later scientific surveying gradually removed many phantom islands from serious geography. Some disappeared quickly once their supposed locations were repeatedly crossed. Others lingered stubbornly into the age of print, and a few lasted far longer than seems reasonable from the comfort of a modern desk. High Brazil, for example, was still appearing in some mapping traditions centuries after its medieval emergence, with the Library of Congress showing how its name and location shifted through early modern maps. St. Brendan's Island also remained on maps for a long time in varying positions, even as attempts to locate it failed, and the Atlantic became more thoroughly travelled. These long afterlives remind us that erasing an island from a map can take longer than drawing it in the first place. Antillia's decline was tied closely to the transformation of the Atlantic after Columbus. Once European maps began absorbing the Caribbean and the American mainland, the old mid-Atlantic phantom had less room to breathe. The Western Ocean was no longer a vague stage for hidden islands alone. It had new coastlines, real archipelagos, contested colonies, and enormous political consequences. The name Antillia did not vanish entirely. It helped echo into the naming traditions of the Antilles. But the old rectangular island with 7 cities became harder to maintain. Reality had not made the Atlantic less strange, but it had made it strange in different ways. The ghost island was overtaken by real ones. Still, placing Antillia within this family makes its story richer rather than smaller. It was not an embarrassing exception to otherwise rational map-making. It was one expression of a broader Atlantic imagination in which ancient philosophy, Christian legend, Celtic folklore, sailors' rumours, royal ambition, and practical charting all shared space. Atlantis, High Brazil, St. Brendan's Island, Saturnases, and Antillia were different answers to the same pressure. What do we put in the unknown? Some answered with warning, some with paradise, some with memory, some with moral ruin. Antillia answered with 7 cities of survival set inside a neat island west of home. And as the family of phantom islands begins to fade under the pressure of exploration, one question becomes more interesting than whether Antillia was real. The answer to that, at least as a physical island in the mid-Atlantic, is no. The deeper question is why it lasted after doubt should have gathered around it. Why did mapmakers keep drawing it? Why did rulers still authorize searches? Why did the island remain useful even as ships began to cross more of the ocean? To answer that, we have to look not at the birth of the ghost island, but at its persistence, the long afterlife of a place that should have disappeared sooner, yet somehow kept its seat at the table of geography. The strange thing about Antillia is not only that people drew it, the stranger thing is that they kept drawing it. A mistake can happen once, a rumour can slip into one chart. A story can be given a coastline by one confident hand, and then, with enough embarrassment, quietly removed by the next person who notices that the ocean is not cooperating. But Antillia did not behave like a brief error. It settled into the habits of 15th century cartography. It appeared, reappeared, shifted, gained labels, lost companions, gathered explanations, and lingered long enough to become part of the mental furniture of the Atlantic. It was not on every map, and some important map makers left it out, which is worth remembering. But it appeared often enough, and in serious enough contexts, that its survival becomes a puzzle of its own. Why did this ghost island refuse to disappear? Part of the answer is simple, and simple answers are sometimes the most stubborn. Copying is easier than erasing. A mapmaker did not sit down with a blank mind and a perfectly empty ocean. He worked from earlier charts, written descriptions, sailors' accounts, inherited legends, and the expectations of the people who would use or admire the finished map. If a respected chart showed Antillia, then leaving it out required a decision. Keeping it required less of one. The island had already entered the tradition. It had already been given a place. Once a feature becomes part of the accepted visual vocabulary of a region, it develops inertia. It sits there, quietly saying, "Are you really sure you want to remove me?" And in the 15th century Atlantic, certainty was not always easy to come by. The earliest clear depiction of Antillia is usually identified with the 1424 Portolan chart of Juan Epitzigano, where it appears as a large rectangular island far west of Portugal and Spain, with related islands nearby. After that, it appeared repeatedly in 15th century nautical charts, before gradually fading after Columbus's voyages changed European mapping of the Atlantic. That repeated appearance matters because repetition can begin to feel like confirmation, even when it is really inheritance. If one map shows a distant island, you may doubt it. If several maps show it, you may begin to assume there is a reason, but those several maps may be cousins, not witnesses. They may share sources. They may be copying the same older uncertainty. The island multiplies on parchment without multiplying in the sea. This is one of the quiet tricks of information. A claim can look stronger simply because it is seen in more places. The human mind is not always careful about asking whether those places are independent. We do this even now, with far more advanced tools and far fewer excuses involving candlelight. We see the same claim repeated in articles, posts, summaries and videos, and it starts to feel settled, even if all of them trace back to the same shaky beginning. Antillia was a medieval version of that problem, only drawn with more elegant handwriting. The more it appeared, the more familiar it became. The more familiar it became, the easier it was to include again. Another reason Antillia survived is that disproving an island is harder than it sounds, especially in a very large ocean. Finding land only requires one successful encounter. Proving the absence of land requires repeated failure in the right place, with enough navigational confidence to make the failure meaningful. In the 15th century, ships did not cross the Atlantic in tidy survey grids. They followed winds, currents, missions, fears, orders, and the practical limits of food and water. If a captain did not find Antillia, that did not necessarily end the matter. Perhaps he had passed too far north. Perhaps the island lay farther west. Perhaps the chart's distance was wrong. Perhaps weather hid it. Perhaps the crew had seen it but misidentified it. Perhaps the earlier report referred to another island entirely. A missing island always had somewhere to hide inside uncertainty. Longitude made this especially troublesome. Latitude could be estimated with some success by observing the sun or stars, but longitude at sea remained a difficult problem until much later, when accurate marine timekeeping allowed sailors to compare local time with a reference time. Before that, east-west position could be uncertain enough to give a phantom island a generous amount of room. Antillia did not need the Atlantic to be infinite. It only needed it to be large, partly known and measured imperfectly. That was more than enough. The island could slide around in the imagination, staying just beyond the last failed search, like a cat refusing to come out from under a sofa. It also helped that Antillia was not absurd in the world that produced it. New Atlantic islands really were entering European knowledge. The Canaries, Madeira, the Azores, and Cape Verde all belonged to a changing oceanic picture. Portolan charts had originally developed around practical maritime needs, with detailed coastlines and networks of direction lines. But by the later medieval period, their world had expanded beyond the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic. If real islands were being found in the ocean, then rumoured islands were not automatically laughable. A sailor or mapmaker could think, perhaps this one too. The existence of real discoveries gave shelter to false ones. Reality, in a rather unhelpful twist, made imagination more credible. Antillia also refused to disappear because it was useful before it was proven. That may be the most important point. We often think truth is what makes an idea useful, but history is full of ideas that were useful because people wanted them to be true, or because they organised uncertainty in a helpful way. Antillia gave the Western Atlantic structure. It suggested a possible landfall, a possible refuge, a possible Christian society, a possible target for exploration, and a possible halfway point in an ocean that otherwise seemed enormous and bare. A blank sea is honest, but it is not very comforting. Antillia made the blankness less blank. It gave viewers something to think with. The Seven Cities legend was central to that usefulness. The island was not merely a rock or a nameless coast. It was said to be populated by descendants of Christian refugees who had fled the Muslim conquest of Iberia, led by bishops who founded 7 settlements. The University of Minnesota's Bell Library notes that the details shown on Antillia in the 1424 chart and later images, including place names in some versions, make it tempting to imagine the island as something more than myth, even though those names cannot be identified securely with modern places or even explained with certainty. That temptation is exactly the point. Names, bays, and cities make a place feel solid. They turn a rumour into something with internal detail. Once a map offers that detail, disbelief has to work harder. The story also answered emotional needs. Antillia was a refuge island, a place where defeat had not meant extinction. In the legend, Christian communities escaped disaster and preserved themselves across the sea. That idea gave the island moral weight. It was not only interesting, it was consoling. It said that history's losses might have hidden survivals. Somewhere beyond the horizon, something endangered had endured. Such stories are not easily abandoned, because abandoning them means losing more than a cartographic feature. It means giving up a small hope. People can be very slow to surrender hopes that have been drawn neatly and labelled in ink. Royal interest helped too. Antillia and the Seven Cities were mentioned in Portuguese royal contexts, including a 1475 grant by King Afonso V to Fernão Teles involving the Seven Cities and other populated islands he might find, and a 1486 authorisation under King João II for Fernão Dulmo to search for the island of Seven Cities. Official attention does not prove belief, but it strengthens plausibility. When a king's administration treats an island as something worth granting or searching for, the island gains social reality. It enters documents. It becomes part of plans. It can be spoken of not merely as a tale, but as a possible object of policy. And policy has a way of making uncertain things sound serious. Nothing gives a ghost a firmer outline quite like paperwork. There is a dry practicality in those grants as well. Unknown islands were inexpensive to promise. A ruler could grant rights to a place not yet found without immediately giving away anything tangible. If the search failed, little was lost. If the search succeeded, the crown had a relationship to the discovery. This was not foolish. It was a calculated way to handle uncertainty. But it also meant that phantom places could gain official life before physical discovery. Antillia did not have to sit in the ocean to matter. It only had to sit in the imagination of a court that saw value in Western possibilities. The island's persistence was also helped by adaptability. Antillia was not always drawn in exactly the same way. Its companions sometimes changed. Its labels varied. Some maps included Satanazes nearby. Others omitted it. Some placed Antillia more boldly. Others reduced or adjusted it. This flexibility allowed the island to survive changing conditions. A completely fixed claim is easier to disprove. A flexible claim can bend. If the island was too large, it could become smaller. If it was too far west, it could be moved. If the Seven Cities seemed too legendary, the name might remain while the story softened. Antillia endured partly because it could be reinterpreted without being entirely erased. At the same time, it was not infinitely flexible. Its recognisable rectangular form and Seven Cities association gave it an identity. This balance between stability and adaptability is one reason ideas last. Too rigid, and they break under pressure. Too vague, and they dissolve. Antillia had enough detail to be memorable, and enough uncertainty to be movable. It was a very efficient ghost, which is not a compliment one gets to give often. The arrival of Columbus's voyages in the 1490s changed the situation, but not as instantly as one might expect. When Europeans began to map the Caribbean and the American mainland, the Atlantic did not suddenly become simple. It became more complicated. Old expectations of Asia, island chains, biblical geography, classical geography, and new discoveries all had to be sorted together. Antillia gradually disappeared from most maps after the North Atlantic became more routinely sailed and more accurately mapped, while its name survived in connection with the Antilles. This slow fading shows that correction is a process, not a single moment. A new fact does not automatically erase an old framework. The old framework first tries to absorb the new fact. That is why Antillia did not simply vanish when the Caribbean entered European awareness. Instead, the name and expectation shifted. Some writers associated Antillia's heritage with islands in the West Indies, and the term Antilles eventually became attached to Caribbean island groups. The ghost island lost its old body but left behind a name. This is a rather elegant form of survival. Antillia stopped being a rectangular landmass west of Portugal, but it did not disappear from language. It became a shadow in the naming of real geography. The island was not found, yet it still managed to arrive. There is also the matter of prestige. Once an idea has been included in respected maps, admitting it was wrong can be uncomfortable. Not necessarily shameful in a dramatic way, with cartographers throwing quills across the room and vowing never to trust a bishop again, but uncomfortable enough. Knowledge traditions tend to protect themselves. A feature copied by skilled people over many years does not get erased casually. The more learned the setting, the more gracefully the correction must be handled. Antillia's removal was therefore gradual. It could be omitted by some, reduced by others, reinterpreted by others still. The ghost was not dragged out of cartography in chains. It was allowed to fade politely, which is often how old eras prefer to leave. Comparisons with other phantom islands show that Antillia's persistence was not unusual. High Brazil, for instance, was shown on maps west of Ireland for centuries, rooted in Irish folklore about an island hidden by mist and visible only rarely. The Library of Congress notes that Hy-Brasil appeared under several names, and was often mapped even though it never existed as a real island. This broader pattern helps explain Antillia. Phantom islands survived because they were protected by poor verification, inherited authority, flexible stories, and human desire. Antillia had all of these, plus the extra strength of royal interest in the Seven Cities legend. It was not an isolated oddity. It was a particularly well-supported member of a larger species. There was another reason the ghost lingered. People did not always need a sharp boundary between real, possible, and legendary. Modern readers often want old map features sorted into neat categories: real island, mythical island, mistake, metaphor, hoax. But earlier map users could live with more ambiguity. A place might be doubtful but worth showing, legendary but possibly based on truth, unverified but reported, symbolic but geographically suggestive. In a world where new discoveries were genuinely overturning assumptions, caution could mean preserving possibilities rather than deleting them. Antillia occupied that middle shelf, neither fully believed nor fully dismissed. Many long-lived ideas do their best work from that shelf. The island also persisted because it had narrative momentum. The story did not stop at the original flight of the bishops. Later accounts added sightings, encounters, Portuguese-speaking inhabitants, silver in the sands, and connections to newly discovered western lands. One later tradition reported that a Portuguese ship reached the island in 1447 and met inhabitants who said they had fled during the time of King Roderick. By around 1500, another map inscription even claimed silver could be found in Antillia's sands. These additions refresh the legend. They gave it new episodes. A story with fresh details feels alive. Even doubtful details can keep a tradition from becoming dusty. That detail about silver is especially revealing. Once wealth enters a rumour, the rumour gains a new audience. A hidden Christian refuge appeals to memory and faith. A hidden island with silver appeals to investors, rulers, and anyone who has ever looked at a risky voyage and thought, yes, but what if it pays? This does not mean greed invented Antillia, but greed could help preserve interest in it. Exploration needed funding, and funding liked promise. A ghost island with cities was intriguing. A ghost island with precious metal in its sand was suddenly wearing a much more attractive hat. The island's refusal to disappear was therefore not one refusal, but many small survivals. It survived because mapmakers copied it. It survived because sailors could not easily disprove it. It survived because Western islands were plausible. It survived because the Seven Cities legend made it meaningful. It survived because rulers could grant and search for uncertain places. It survived because later writers refreshed it with new claims. It survived because its name could migrate when its body became inconvenient. And beneath all of that, it survived because humans often prefer a populated unknown to an empty one. By the early 16th century, however, the conditions that had protected Antillia were weakening. The Atlantic was being crossed more frequently. The Caribbean was being mapped. The old mid-ocean rectangle had less room to hide. As European knowledge of the Americas expanded, Antillia's old position became increasingly difficult to defend. It could shrink, shift, and lend its name elsewhere, but it could no longer sit with the same confidence west of Iberia. The ghost island had lasted because uncertainty gave it space. Once that space narrowed, the ghost began to thin. And yet, even as the island faded from serious charts, it left behind something valuable. Not a harbour, not 7 cities, not a hidden Christian commonwealth, and certainly not a convenient place to stop for fresh water halfway across the Atlantic. It left behind a record of how people handle the unknown. Antillia shows that knowledge does not advance by cleanly replacing darkness with light. It advances through rumour, copying, correction, argument, hope, disappointment, and revision. Sometimes a false island can teach us more than a real one, because the real island only has to be found. The false one asks why it was believed. So Antillia refused to disappear because it was never only a geographical claim. It was a useful shape in an uncertain ocean, a hopeful story after historical loss, a professional habit in chart making, and a possible prize in a competitive age of exploration. Its physical absence eventually caught up with it, as physical absence usually does, though sometimes rather late and with poor manners, but by then Antillia had already done its work. It had helped fill the Western Sea with expectation. It had shown how legends become coastlines, and how coastlines can outlive the evidence that first put them there. And as the old rectangle finally begins to fade from the map, what remains is not simply the correction of an error, but the quieter question of what the vanished shore still tells us about maps, memory, and the way human beings look into empty space, and almost always imagine something waiting there. By the time Antillia began to fade from European maps, it had already lived a surprisingly full life for a place that no one could reliably reach. It had been drawn as a large island west of Iberia. It had carried the story of 7 cities founded by refugees. It had appeared in serious nautical charts, attracted royal interest, and sat in the Atlantic with the calm confidence of a place that expected ships to come looking. Then, slowly, the world changed around it. The ocean that had once been wide enough to shelter rumour became busier. More ships crossed farther west. More coastlines were reported, argued over, renamed, claimed and redrawn. The Americas entered European maps, first uncertainly, and then with increasing force. The Caribbean became a real geography of islands, harbours, currents, peoples, conflicts and empires. The old rectangular island in the middle distance no longer had the same room to breathe. It was not dramatically disproved in a single theatrical moment. No captain stood on deck, swept his arm across empty water and declared, "Behold, no Antillia," although one imagines it would have been satisfying. Instead, the island thinned gradually. It was copied less often, its shape became less useful. Its name drifted toward real islands farther west. The shore vanished not by sinking beneath the waves, but by losing its place in the mapmaker's mind. That is one of the first things Antillia teaches us. Ideas do not always disappear when they are shown to be wrong. Sometimes they fade because the world around them becomes too detailed for them to survive. When the Atlantic was poorly known, Antillia could sit comfortably among possibilities. A mapmaker could draw it and think perhaps. A sailor could hear of it and think maybe. A ruler could grant rights related to it and think if found. But as more actual geography arrived, the old maybe had less protection. Real islands are demanding neighbours. They require more accurate placement, clearer names, routes, harbours, reports, and claims. Once the Caribbean and American coastlines began filling European charts, Antillia's old position became awkward. The phantom island had belonged to an Atlantic of expectation. It struggled in an Atlantic of encounter, and yet the disappearance was not complete. Antillia left traces. The name lingered in forms connected with the Antilles, those real island chains of the Caribbean that European mapmakers and writers came to describe after Columbus's voyages. This is a curious kind of survival. The island itself vanished, but its name found work elsewhere. It is rather like a guest who leaves the party but somehow manages to have their coat appear in every photograph afterward. That survival tells us something about the way maps preserve older ideas even while updating themselves. A name can outlive the belief that first carried it. A legend can lose its body and remain as vocabulary. Geography is full of such fossils. Old hopes, old errors, old guesses, old conquests, old misunderstandings, all hardened into names that people use long after the original story has gone quiet. Antillia also teaches us that maps are not simply mirrors of the world. They are records of what people thought they knew, what they had heard, what they hoped for, and what they were willing to trust. A modern map can make this easy to forget. We tap a screen, and there we are, a small blue dot on a network of roads, buildings, rivers, and borders, all updating as if the world itself were politely reporting in. It feels immediate, almost effortless. But older maps make the work visible. They show knowledge being assembled, not delivered. They show coastlines becoming clearer in some places while remaining uncertain in others. They show real islands beside phantom ones, careful observation beside inherited story, and practical navigation beside rumour. Antillia sits right at that crossing point. It reminds us that a map is not only a statement of facts, it is also a snapshot of confidence. Confidence is the important word. Antillia looked confident. It had a shape, it had a name, it had cities. It appeared among compass lines and real coastlines. But confidence and truth are not the same thing. This is not only a lesson about 15th century cartography, it is a lesson about human judgment. We are all vulnerable to confident presentation. A clean diagram can make a weak claim feel strong. A repeated statement can make an uncertain idea feel established. A familiar label can make a vague concept feel well understood. Antillia benefited from all of these effects. It was repeated, labelled, and drawn with skill. It was placed in a format associated with practical knowledge. It wore the costume of fact long enough for many people to treat it as possible. The ghost island did not need to shout, it simply had to look settled. There is a gentler lesson here too. The people who drew Antillia were not necessarily foolish. It is easy, from the comfort of the present, to look back and smile at a phantom island on a map. We know it was not there. We know the Atlantic does not contain a large rectangular island of 7 lost cities west of Portugal. But the people who preserved it were working inside a different information world. They did not have satellite surveys. They did not have global positioning systems. They did not have centuries of accumulated oceanic crossings laid neatly behind them. They had reports, fragments, older maps, stories, practical experience and uncertainty. They had to decide what to include when the evidence was incomplete. Sometimes they chose wrongly, but wrong choices made under uncertainty are not the same as stupidity. In many ways, Antillia is a monument to the difficulty of knowing, not merely the failure to know. That difficulty is still familiar. We may not be filling our maps with islands of runaway bishops, which is probably for the best, as it would make airport geography more confusing than it already is. But we still navigate incomplete information. We still build mental maps of the world from partial reports. We still trust some sources more than others because they look professional, familiar, or widely repeated. We still struggle to remove old ideas once they have settled into our habits. Antillia asks us to be patient with past mistakes, but also alert to our own. Every age has its phantom islands. They're not always drawn in blue water. Sometimes they are assumptions about other people. Sometimes they are outdated beliefs about places we have never visited. Sometimes they are fears that occupy more space in the mind than they deserve. Sometimes they are hopes we keep on the map because removing them would make the future look too empty. The island also reminds us that legends often grow where people need them. The Seven Cities story was not random decoration. It answered a longing. It imagined that a community shattered by conquest had survived somewhere beyond reach. It turned loss into continuity. That emotional purpose helped the island endure. A purely technical error might have been easier to erase. A meaningful error is harder. People do not only believe things because the evidence is strong, they believe them because the belief fits into a larger need. Antillia offered refuge, order, Christian memory, and a safe western shore. It made the Atlantic feel less empty and history feel less final. Those are powerful services for a map feature to provide. This does not mean the legend was harmless in every sense. Imagined geographies could shape real ambitions. A rumoured island could attract voyages. A supposed Christian refuge could become a target of royal interest. A possible western land could feed the broader appetite for expansion. Antillia belonged to a period when European powers were beginning to push aggressively into the Atlantic world, with consequences that would be enormous and often devastating for the peoples already living in the lands Europeans came to map, claim and colonize. The ghost island itself was not responsible for that history, but it was part of the same widening mental horizon. It shows how maps can prepare people to move toward places before those places are fully known. A line of ink can be a quiet invitation. As Antillia faded, the Atlantic did not become less mysterious. It became differently mysterious. The old question, is there an island of 7 cities out there, gave way to larger and more complicated questions about continents, oceans, peoples, trade, power, and the shape of the Earth itself. The disappearance of one phantom island did not end human error. It simply marked a stage in the long correction of a particular map, and that correction was not clean. Early maps of the Americas were full of misunderstandings, misplaced coastlines, uncertain interiors, and names that reflected European confusion as much as knowledge. Antillia left the stage, but uncertainty remained very busy behind the curtain, probably rearranging props and labelling them incorrectly. Still, there is something satisfying about the island's slow vanishing. It shows evidence doing its quiet work. Ships sailed. Reports accumulated. Real coastlines were compared with the old charts. Empty water became more meaningful. Eventually, the island could no longer justify its place. This is how knowledge often improves. Not with one perfect discovery, but with many corrections. A line is moved. A name is changed. A blank is filled. A false island is omitted. Someone notices that an old belief no longer fits the growing pattern. The world on the map becomes a little closer to the world beneath it. That process can be slow, but it is also reassuring. Reality may be patient, but it does tend to have the final word, even if it waits several generations and arrives with no dramatic music. Antillia also shows that being wrong can still be historically valuable. If the island had never existed on maps, we would have lost a window into the fears and hopes of the people who imagined the Western Ocean. A correct map tells us where things are. An incorrect map can tell us what people expected, remembered, desired, and misunderstood. That does not make error better than accuracy, of course. If you are sailing, you generally prefer the island to exist where the map says it does. But for historians, mistakes are often generous. They reveal the structure of thought. Antillia reveals a world in which religious memory, practical exploration, rumour, and cartographic craft could all meet on the same sheet of parchment. It shows how the unknown was not empty. It was crowded with meanings. The vanishing shore also gives us a useful way to think about discovery. Discovery is often told as a heroic act. Someone goes out, finds something, and returns with knowledge. But the story of Antillia reminds us that exploration also involves unfinding things. People had to discover that certain mapped places were not there. They had to remove false land from the ocean. They had to make the sea emptier in order to make the map truer. That is a different kind of discovery, quieter and less celebrated. No one builds many monuments to the captain who sailed through a supposed island and found only waves, and yet that absence mattered. Every vanished phantom made room for more accurate geography. Sometimes knowledge advances not by adding a new place, but by learning to leave a space blank. There is humility in that blankness. A blank space can be honest. It can say, "We do not know yet." It can resist the temptation to fill uncertainty with something comforting. Medieval and early modern mapmakers were not always comfortable leaving the unknown empty, but neither are we. We fill gaps quickly, often before we have noticed that they are gaps. Antillia teaches the value of waiting. It suggests that uncertainty should sometimes remain uncertain. There is no shame in saying, the ocean may contain something, but we do not yet know what. That may not be as exciting as drawing 7 hidden cities, but it is better navigation. And yet, it would be a shame to treat Antillia only as a warning. It is also a reminder of imagination's role in exploration. People do not cross oceans for measurements alone. They cross because they expect something, fear something, seek something, or dream of something. Imagination can mislead, but it can also move people into contact with reality. The idea of Western Islands was partly wrong and partly productive. It filled maps with ghosts, yes, but it also formed part of the atmosphere that pushed sailors outward, where they encountered real places and real peoples, with all the consequences that followed. Human curiosity is rarely tidy. It carries good questions, bad assumptions, courage, greed, hope, and confusion in the same hold. Antillia was packed somewhere among them. By now, the island itself has become a different kind of place. It no longer belongs to navigation. No sailor sets a course for its bays. No king grants rights to its cities. No mapmaker needs to decide whether to draw its long rectangular coast. Instead, Antillia lives in the history of maps, in articles, archives, old charts, and the imagination of anyone who enjoys the soft strangeness of a land that was believed into shape and then corrected back into water. It has become a teaching island, not a real one, but a useful one. It gives us a way to talk about evidence, repetition, memory, and the emotional life of geography. And perhaps that is why ghost islands remain so compelling. They are mistakes, but they are also stories about the edges of knowledge. They stand where certainty runs out. They show what people do when the map ends but the mind continues. Antillia's shore vanished because it was never a shore of stone, sand and surf. It was a shore made from reports, copies, legends, hopes, and the old need to make the unknown feel inhabitable. Once better knowledge arrived that shore could no longer hold, the sea took it back, not with waves, but with correction. So, as we come back from that imaginary island, back across the Atlantic, back past the old charts and their compass lines, back to wherever you are listening from tonight, it may be worth asking what maps we carry in our own minds. What places have we drawn too confidently? What uncertainties have we filled too quickly? What old names do we still use without remembering the stories behind them? And what blank spaces might deserve to remain blank a little longer, not because we lack curiosity, but because curiosity and patience are better companions than curiosity and haste. Antillia was never found, but it was not meaningless. It helped people picture an ocean that frightened and fascinated them. It preserved an old story of loss and survival. It showed how professional tools can carry uncertain claims. It showed how repetition can harden into confidence. It showed how hope can become geography, and how geography can later become history. And in the end, when the island slipped away from the maps, it left behind a quieter kind of knowledge, the understanding that the world is not only discovered by drawing lines, but also by learning which lines to erase. And so, dear listener, our voyage to the island that was not there comes gently back to shore. We began with a strange question about a rectangle in the Atlantic, and we followed it through 7 cities, old legends, portolan charts, sailors' rumours, royal ambitions, and the wider family of phantom islands that once crowded the Western Sea. Along the way, Antillia turned out not to be a simple mistake, but a small window into how humans think when the world is still unfinished. It was false as land, but true as evidence of longing. It was absent from the ocean, but present in the culture that drew it. And maybe that is why it still holds our attention after all these centuries. Not because we expect to find it, but because we recognise the impulse that made people look for it. If this quiet journey through old maps and vanished shores has helped you settle, or given your thoughts somewhere gentle to wander, I would be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, or shared it with someone who enjoys the strange corners of the Earth's history. And before sleep finally folds the map for the night, I'll ask one last thing. Where are you listening from? And what does the unknown look like from where you are? Maybe it is an ocean. Maybe it is a future plan. Maybe it is simply tomorrow morning, waiting beyond the dark like a coast not yet drawn. Wherever you are, and whatever maps you carry, I hope the rest of your night is calm, your thoughts grow quiet, and no phantom islands keep you awake for too long. Sleep well, fellow traveller, and may every shore you need to find appear gently in its own time.